It began not with the infamous names of Auschwitz or Treblinka, but in a small village in western Poland where the machinery of mass murder was tested for the very first time. Chelmno, established in December 1941, was the Nazi regime's first extermination camp, the site where industrialized killing moved from theory to practice, and where the gas van became the prototype for death on an unimaginable scale. Hidden behind the facade of an old manor house, guarded by SS men and auxiliaries, Chelmno was a place where victims arrived on trains and trucks, reassured with lies, stripped of their belongings, and led to basements and barns that became gateways to the end. Here, over 150,000 men, women and children, mostly Jews from the Łódź Ghetto, but also Poles, Romani and others, were murdered in silence, their bodies buried in nearby forests. Yet despite the enormity of its crimes, Chelmno has remained one of the least remembered names in the long list of Nazi horrors, overshadowed by larger camps, but no less central to the story of the final solution. In this documentary we will trace the origins of Chelmno, the methods of killing devised here, the experiences of the victims, the role of the perpetrators, and the silence that followed its dismantling. We will examine how this camp became both a laboratory of genocide and a graveyard of entire communities, and why its memory matters today. As you listen, I encourage you to stay with us to the very end, because every detail, every testimony, and every trace of Chelmno's story carries the weight of lives that history tried to erase. And before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It helps us connect this story across the world, and it reminds us that remembrance is a shared responsibility for all of humanity. In the winter of 1941, as the Second World War reached a new and terrifying phase, the Nazi leadership shifted from persecution to annihilation. Years of anti-Semitic propaganda, laws of exclusion, and orchestrated violence had prepared the groundwork for a radical decision. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle, emboldened by military victories in Eastern Europe and intoxicated with racial ideology, moved toward implementing what they called the final solution. This phrase, clinical and deceptively bureaucratic, concealed an intent to murder millions. Already Einsatzgruppen had swept across the Soviet Union, leaving killing fields littered with the bodies of men, women, and children. Yet these mass shootings, brutal as they were, consumed vast resources and created psychological burdens even for hardened killers. The Nazi regime demanded something more efficient, more detached, and more industrial. They required a system that could extinguish life quickly and secretly, without the spectacle of public massacres. In this climate of logistical necessity and ideological hatred, the blueprint of the extermination camp emerged. It would not be a prison nor a labor facility, but a machine designed for killing, and the very first of these experiments in pure extermination would be Chelmno. Chelmno, or Kolmhof in German, was a small village in occupied Poland, barely known outside its rural district. The site was chosen with care for its isolation, proximity to rail lines, and ability to operate in secrecy. Unlike the sprawling complexes that would later horrify the world, Chelmno was modest in size, a country estate with an adjoining forest. Yet within this quiet setting, the Nazis would pioneer methods of mass murder that would influence every extermination camp that followed. The estate's manor house, with its thick walls and secluded position, became the administrative center of death. The nearby forest clearing, tranquil to the unknowing eye, was destined to become a burial ground for tens of thousands. It was here that mobile gas vans, an invention perfected by the SS, would first be employed systematically. Victims would board believing they were bound for labor or resettlement, only to suffocate in carbon monoxide as the engines ran. The process, cold and detached, epitomized the Nazi ambition to blend industrial methods with mass killing. Chelmno would thus become the prototype, the grim laboratory of extermination. The decision to establish Chelmno reflected the regime's growing impatience with incremental measures. By 1941, the ghettos of Poland were overflowing, disease and hunger rampant, and deportations unworkable on a large scale. German authorities complained of the Jewish problem becoming a logistical crisis. The solution, as dictated by Berlin, was no longer resettlement but removal, total and permanent. Chelmno's creation represented the shift from persecution to annihilation, from containment to liquidation. Unlike earlier camps designed for forced labor, it had no workshops, no barracks for production, no infrastructure to exploit human beings for work. Its single purpose was destruction. Victims would arrive, be deceived into compliance, stripped of their belongings, and then murdered with mechanical precision. This made Chelmno both horrifyingly efficient and chillingly symbolic, the first camp conceived entirely for extermination. In its operations, the Nazis crossed a threshold into genocide. The origins of Chelmno also lay in the bureaucratic culture of the Nazi state. Each stage of planning involved offices in Berlin, SS units in Poland, and local German administrators. To the perpetrators, this was not framed as mass murder, but as an administrative measure. The language of paperwork masked the brutality of reality, reducing human lives to statistics and transport lists. For Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, Chelmno was an opportunity to test methods later to be scaled across occupied Europe. They sought a model that could be expanded, replicated, and controlled. The camp thus stood at the intersection of ideology and pragmatism, where racist hatred fused with technical efficiency. Orders flowed down the chain of command, and on the ground, officers like Herbert Lang carried them out with ruthless discipline. This bureaucracy of death gave Chelmno an aura of orderliness, but behind it lurked chaos and suffering. The camp was born not only of hatred, but of organizational coldness that stripped morality from human action. This is why Chelmno stands as the dark genesis of the Holocaust's machinery. The very concept of Chelmno carried an unsettling innovation. For centuries, persecution had taken many forms: expulsions, pogroms, legal discrimination. But never before had there been a site established solely for killing on such a scale, with no pretense of rehabilitation or assimilation. The camp's design marked the evolution of genocide into a process. It was not an eruption of violence, but a system of steps calibrated to conceal, deceive, and destroy. The Nazis engineered every stage with attention to detail, from how victims were transported, to how their possessions were catalogued, to how their bodies were disposed of. This made Chelmno not just a place of death, but a template for bureaucratic mass murder. In its chilling efficiency, the camp revealed how ordinary structures could be repurposed for extraordinary evil. Chelmno was less about spectacle and more about system, a hidden mechanism grinding away in the forests of Poland. Its obscurity during the war was part of its effectiveness. The camp existed in the shadows, its victims silenced before the world could know. By choosing Chelmno, the Nazis also chose secrecy over visibility. Unlike Auschwitz, which would become infamous for its sprawling size and multiple functions, Chelmno was deliberately small and concealed. The village itself had little significance, allowing the SS to operate without attracting wide attention. Transports arrived quietly, their passengers believing they were heading toward resettlement or labor. The killing was done quickly, the evidence buried in the nearby woods. Unlike the mass shootings of the Einsatzgruppen, there were no witnesses beyond the perpetrators and a handful of forced laborers. This secrecy was essential to the Nazi project, for they understood the potential outcry if the truth spread too widely. Chelmno's existence thus reveals the regime's duality, boastful in propaganda, yet secretive in its worst crimes. It demonstrates how genocide was built not only on ideology, but also on calculated concealment. The camp was designed to kill in silence, leaving little trace, and in that silence lay its terrible power. The establishment of Chelmno also signaled the Nazi determination to escalate. In December 1941, the first transports rolled in, marking the beginning of an operation that would claim at least 150,000 lives. Most were Jews from the Łódź Ghetto, but also Roma, Poles, and Soviet prisoners were among the victims. For these people, Chelmno was the end of the line, the culmination of years of discrimination and oppression. Their lives ended not in battlefields or public squares, but in suffocating darkness inside a moving truck. The gas vans were a precursor to the fixed gas chambers that would define other camps. At Chelmno, this new technology of death was tested, refined, and systematized. Each transport became part of a deadly rhythm, each victim another number in a growing tally. The camp thus foreshadowed what was to come, a grim rehearsal for mass extermination across Europe. Chelmno was the opening act of the final solution's most mechanized phase. It was here that murder became a process as relentless as it was impersonal. To understand Chelmno is to confront the origins of industrialized genocide. It was not the largest camp, nor the most infamous, but it was the first to embody the principle of extermination as policy. In its quiet village setting, the Nazis revealed the future of their racial war. Here, hatred was transformed into procedure, and murder into routine. Chelmno's existence reminds us that genocide does not always begin with grand declarations, but with hidden experiments that spiral into vast systems of death. It represents the threshold moment when persecution became annihilation, when ghettos became feeder lines to extermination. The camp's obscurity in public memory mirrors the secrecy of its operations during the war. Yet its role is foundational, for without Chelmno, there would have been no Treblinka, no Belzec, no Sobibor. It was the laboratory of the final solution, the first whisper of a coming storm, and in that whisper lay the shadow of genocide, stretching across all of Europe. The selection of Chelmno was not arbitrary, but the product of Nazi calculation rooted in geography, logistics, and secrecy. Situated in the Warthagar, an area of occupied Poland annexed directly into the Reich, it stood within a zone earmarked for rapid Germanization. Its proximity to the city of Łódź, where one of the largest ghettos in Europe still confined over 150,000 Jews, made it a natural point of extermination. The Nazis required a site close enough to handle mass deportations from Łódź, but remote enough to carry out killing operations without attracting attention. Chelmno's sleepy village, with its manor house, surrounding forest and river access, fit this requirement with chilling precision. German authorities in Poznan recognized that the rural location reduced the risk of prying eyes, while rail lines and roads ensured efficient transport of victims. This combination of isolation and accessibility made Chelmno ideal. It offered secrecy for perpetrators, logistical ease for deportations, and total control for the SS. In choosing Chelmno, the Nazis demonstrated their preference for sites that could blend murder into the landscape, and in doing so, they created the first camp built solely to exterminate. Chelmno's position within the Warthagar also reflected the Nazis' ideological priorities. This annexed region, governed by Gauleiter Arthur Greiser, was one of the harshest laboratories of racial policy. Greiser and SS leader Wilhelm Koppe oversaw ruthless efforts to cleanse the area of Jews and Poles, paving the way for German settlers. The camp at Chelmno became their solution to the Jewish problem within the territory. By eliminating the Jewish population quickly, they could accelerate the project of demographic engineering envisioned by Hitler. The camp's location thus tied extermination directly to Nazi colonization. This was not merely about killing, but about remaking space, transforming Polish villages into German strongholds. Chelmno symbolized the violent clearing of land for the so-called Lebensraum, or living space, that Nazi ideology demanded. The destruction of communities in Łódź and nearby towns was the prerequisite for this vision. Chelmno was therefore more than a camp. It was an instrument of conquest, cloaked in barbed wire and forest shadows. Its geography was political, every transport a step toward reshaping Eastern Europe in the image of the Reich. The presence of the Łódź Ghetto was a decisive factor in Chelmno's creation. Established in 1940, it had become a vast prison city, walled off from the world and ruled by starvation, disease, and forced labor. German authorities initially exploited its labor force, supplying the war economy with textiles, metalwork, and other goods. Yet by late 1941, the regime's attitude hardened. The ghetto was now seen less as a resource and more as a burden. Deporting its population to distant camps like Auschwitz or Treblinka was impractical at that stage, as those facilities were not yet fully operational. Chelmno offered a local solution, only 40 miles from Łódź, connected by rail and road. Victims could be rounded up, transported quickly, and killed with minimal delay. The camp thus became the lethal extension of the ghetto's barbed walls, the final destination that lay just beyond its gates. For Jews trapped in Łódź, Chelmno represented the invisible abyss waiting at the end of every selection. Geography and policy converged in this grim efficiency. In essence, Chelmno was the ghetto's shadow, designed to swallow its population whole. The physical features of Chelmno also lent themselves to secrecy and concealment. The estate's manor house, once a noble residence, was easily converted into a processing center where victims were stripped of belongings. Its cellars and outbuildings provided space for sorting property, while the surrounding grounds became assembly areas for prisoners. Most importantly, the nearby Rzeszów forest offered an ideal site for disposal of bodies. In the beginning, enormous pits were dug, where corpses were dumped in layers. Later, when decomposition and disease created unbearable conditions, cremation pyres were constructed to burn the evidence. The forest muffled the cries of the dying and the roar of engines from the gas fans. Villagers in Chelmno and nearby settlements might hear faint echoes, but the SS ensured fear and silence kept people from asking questions. This natural cover gave the camp an aura of invisibility, even as tens of thousands perished. The Nazis understood the power of landscape, and they turned this wooded seclusion into an accomplice to genocide. Chelmno's geography concealed its crimes beneath the canopy of trees, and for years its horrors remained largely hidden. Another factor favoring Chelmno was its connection to infrastructure. Though small, the village lay near the railway network that linked Łódź with other towns in the Wartime. Deportation trains could offload prisoners at Kołol, the nearest station, from where trucks carried them the final miles to the camp. This two-step process enhanced deception. Victims believed they were being transferred to labor sites, not death camps. The short transport by road was efficient, keeping operations flowing without delay. In addition, the camp's proximity to German administrative centers ensured coordination between civilian authorities and SS units. Supplies for the perpetrators, fuel for the gas vans, and construction materials could be delivered without difficulty. The River Ner also provided a waterway, though less significant. It symbolized the camp's integration into local geography. This infrastructure meant Chelmno could operate smoothly with minimal disruption to surrounding areas. It required few staff and little investment compared to larger camps. In this sense, Chelmno was not just convenient, but cost-effective. For the Nazis, this practicality made it a perfect prototype. It combined logistical simplicity with murderous ambition. The choice of Chelmno also reflected a learning process within the Nazi killing apparatus. By late 1941, Einsatzgruppen massacres had shown the limits of mass shootings as a method of extermination. They were bloody, chaotic, and psychologically damaging even for perpetrators. A new model was required, quieter, more efficient, less prone to resistance. Chelmno's rural isolation allowed the SS to test mobile gas vans away from public scrutiny. Here technology could replace bullets, engines could substitute for rifles, and killing could occur inside enclosed steel compartments. The manor house and forest provided the perfect backdrop for this grim experiment. Victims could be funneled through a process that seemed orderly, even mundane. From arrival to undressing to the short walk into vans, each step masked the reality until suffocation began. This deceptive rhythm turned murder into procedure and Chelmno into a proving ground for future extermination. Its location was therefore as much about experimentation as about execution. Chelmno became the workshop of genocide, hidden in plain sight, and the lessons learned here would be exported across occupied Europe. Political control within the Waffengau further influenced the decision. Gold Eater Arthur Greiser was among the most radical Nazi administrators, eager to prove his loyalty to Hitler through ruthless policies. He embraced extermination with zeal, seeing it as the ultimate demonstration of ideological commitment. Chelmno was his answer to the problem of overcrowded ghettos and racial cleansing in his jurisdiction. By placing the camp in his territory, the regime could rely on a fanatical overseer to ensure operations ran smoothly. Greiser and his subordinates championed Chelmno as both a practical and ideological necessity. This willingness to cooperate with the SS highlights the fusion of party, state, and police in the machinery of genocide. Civilian and military authorities alike contributed to its creation. Chelmno thus illustrates how extermination was not solely an SS project, but a collective endeavor. Local German officials provided cover, logistical support, and bureaucratic legitimacy. The camp was not only geographically convenient, but politically aligned. Its establishment was both an act of efficiency and an act of ideological fervor. Chelmno was born from local enthusiasm for radical solutions. Ultimately, Chelmno's selection demonstrates the intersection of geography, ideology, and logistics in Nazi planning. Its nearness to Łódź provided a ready supply of victims. Its rural isolation concealed the killing from the outside world. Its manor house and forest offered ready-made facilities for processing and disposal. Its connections to roads and rail ensured smooth deportations, and its position within a radicalized administrative zone guaranteed political support. Chelmno's establishment was therefore no accident, but the outcome of careful calculation. It became the prototype extermination camp precisely because it offered the right blend of practicality and secrecy. Here in an obscure Polish village, the Nazis built a model that combined deception with destruction, and from Chelmno's forest clearings, the logic of genocide spread outward, shaping the architecture of mass murder across Europe. The camp's location was not incidental, but central to its function. Chelmno was chosen because it could vanish in plain sight, and in that invisibility, the final solution found its first home. The transformation of Chelmno from a quiet estate into a machine of mass murder began in late 1941 under SS leadership. The Nazis requisitioned the old manor house in the village, its faded grandeur now destined to become a hub of bureaucratic death. Once a noble residence, its rooms were gutted, repurposed for prisoner intake, storage of stolen property, and offices for the SS. The building's cellar became a sorting area where valuables were separated, catalogued, and sent deeper into the Reich. This symbolic desecration of a home into headquarters of extermination reflected the Nazi talent for corruption. The manor was not expanded into a large barracks complex, but functioned as an administrative shell, directing victims toward their deaths. Outside its gates, barbed wire and checkpoints enforced secrecy. The site was divided into zones, the manor for processing, the road for transport, and the forest for burial. At first glance, it appeared almost mundane, yet its simplicity masked terrible purpose. This was no concentration camp filled with watchtowers and chimneys. It was instead a killing ground disguised as an ordinary estate, and in that disguise lay its deadly efficiency. Behind the manor stretched the Resichif forest, an ancient woodland soon to be desecrated by mass graves. The Nazis recognized the cover provided by thick trees and soft soil, both of which could hide the evidence of mass killings. Prisoners forced into labor dug enormous pits under SS supervision, wide trenches that became open tombs. Each pit was designed to hold hundreds, later thousands of bodies stacked in layers. The forest muffled the cries and concealed the smoke, when later cremation pyres replaced burial. To the villagers nearby, the woods grew ominously silent, patrolled by guards who warned locals away. It was here that the real machinery of death operated, away from the manor's deceptive facade. Victims never returned from those trees, swallowed by pits carved into the earth. The forest, once a place of life, became synonymous with death. Its soil absorbed blood, its roots tangled with bone, and its branches carried the stench of burning flesh. Chelmno's design fused architecture and nature into a seamless apparatus of annihilation, and in that fusion, the camp's horror became hidden in plain sight. At the heart of Chelmno's system stood the gas vans, the grim innovation that made it a prototype of extermination. These modified trucks looked ordinary from the outside, painted grey or green blending with military vehicles, but inside, their sealed compartments turned into chambers of suffocation once exhaust pipes were rerouted. Victims were told they were being transported to a labor site, ordered to climb inside with promises of relocation. The doors slammed shut, and engines roared as the vehicle jolted forward. Within minutes, the compartment filled with carbon monoxide, robbing the passengers of oxygen. Their screams and pounding fists soon gave way to silence as the van rumbled along forest paths. Upon arrival at the burial pits, doors swung open to reveal piles of lifeless bodies. Prisoner laborers under SS threat dragged corpses from the van and dumped them into trenches. This process became routine, repeated transport after transport, with the vans making multiple trips daily. The gas van was not just a tool, but the essence of Chelmno's design. It symbolized the Nazis' drive to mechanize death itself, and at Chelmno it found its first consistent use. The camp's layout was deliberately simple, a reflection of its singular purpose. Victims arrived at the manor, believing it a transit station for resettlement. They were ordered to undress in outbuildings or barns, their clothes collected and sorted by prisoner labor. This stripping away of dignity was disguised as preparation for showers or travel. From there, they were marched a short distance to the waiting vans. The journey was short, preventing panic from spreading, but long enough to ensure separation from the village. Guards lined the path, their weapons ready to silence resistance. The vans then drove slowly into the forest, their engines serving as the instrument of suffocation. At the graves, corpses were unloaded, and any valuables overlooked in the stripping were retrieved. Each step flowed into the next, a grim choreography designed to appear orderly to the perpetrators. The camp's design represented efficiency to the victims. It was a descent into deception and death. The simplicity was its genius, making Chelmno function smoothly with minimal personnel. And in that simplicity, mass murder became terrifyingly ordinary. The workforce behind Chelmno's machinery of death was shockingly small. Only about 30 to 40 German SS officers and police, along with a contingent of 80 to 100 auxiliary guards, managed the operation. These auxiliaries, often drawn from captured Soviet POWs trained at Trauniki, carried out the dirtiest tasks. They guarded transports, herded victims, and oversaw the unloading of corpses from vans. Prisoner labor units, called Sonderkommando, were forced to dig graves, strip bodies, and maintain the killing process. These men were kept alive only briefly, knowing their own deaths awaited once they became unusable. The SS relied on fear, coercion, and rotation of these units to maintain secrecy. The camp required few guards, because deception reduced the need for force. Most victims submitted, unaware of their fate until suffocation began. This reliance on minimal staff made Chelmno an ideal prototype for expansion elsewhere. It proved that extermination did not require vast armies of guards, only organization and terror. And in this, Chelmno offered a deadly lesson for the broader machinery of genocide. The design of Chelmno also integrated theft as part of extermination. From the moment victims arrived, their possessions were meticulously catalogued and seized. Clothes were sorted, valuables packed, and money siphoned into right coffers. The camp thus functioned as a point of plunder, feeding Germany's economy even as it consumed human lives. Gold teeth were pulled from corpses, jewelry stripped, and even hair sometimes harvested for industrial use. Nothing was wasted. Every object became property of the Reich. The manor's cellar became a warehouse of belongings, a grotesque counterpart to the graves outside. This commodification of victims revealed the economic dimension of extermination. Chelmno was not only a place of death, but of profit. It blended murder with theft, cruelty with cold calculation. The design ensured that extermination enriched the state and its perpetrators. And in this blending, Chelmno reflected the total corruption of Nazi ideology. It was not just about killing, it was about consuming entire communities, body and property alike. Over time, Chelmno's design evolved as the realities of mass killing created logistical challenges. By 1942, the mass graves overflowed, their stench betraying the camp's secret. Decomposition caused pits to collapse, attracting disease and alarming locals. The SS responded with new measures, cremation pits and open-air pyres to burn bodies. Prisoners were forced to exhume earlier graves, stacking bones and corpses onto makeshift grates of railway tracks. Fires consumed thousands, leaving only ash to be scattered in the forest. This gruesome adaptation highlighted the Nazis' obsession with erasing evidence of their crimes. The forest became a furnace, its silence shattered by crackling flames and choking smoke. These changes showed how Chelmno functioned as both a killing site and a laboratory of extermination. Each adjustment made the process more secretive, more destructive, and more efficient. The camp was not static. It evolved with the regime's demands, and in that evolution it foreshadowed the horrifying scale of Operation Reinhard camps. Chelmno taught the SS how to refine mass murder itself. In the end, Chelmno's design embodied the Nazi vision of extermination, hidden, efficient, and systematic. Its manor house processed victims under the guise of resettlement. Its forests swallowed the dead into pits and flames. Its gas vans mechanized murder with clinical detachment. Its small staff demonstrated how few men could orchestrate mass slaughter. Its auxiliary guards and prisoner labor revealed how coercion and complicity sustained the system. Its evolution from burial to cremation proved the Nazis' determination to erase every trace. Chelmno was not a vast industrial complex, but a deceptively modest site. Yet in its simplicity lay its prototype status, a blueprint for the machinery of genocide. It was the first camp designed from the ground up to kill, and nothing else. Chelmno showed that extermination could be organized like a production line, and in that realization, it carved its place in history as the birthplace of mechanized genocide. The gas vans used at Chelmno represented one of the most chilling innovations of the Nazi killing system. Unlike concentration camps where death often came through forced labor, starvation, or firing squads, Chelmno relied on a mobile form of extermination. These vans looked ordinary at first glance, resembling delivery or transport vehicles used throughout occupied Europe, but inside, their cargo hold was transformed into a sealed chamber with steel-lined walls and reinforced doors to prevent escape. The exhaust system was rerouted so that carbon monoxide fumes could be pumped directly inside. Victims, deceived into believing they were being transported to labor camps, were ordered to climb in. The doors clanged shut, plunging them into darkness, and the engines rumbled to life. Within minutes the confined space filled with poison gas, robbing lungs of oxygen and minds of consciousness. The van became a moving gas chamber, combining transportation with execution. At Chelmno, this grisly machine was used systematically for the first time. It proved horrifyingly effective, blending deception, technology, and murder into one seamless process. And it was here that the blueprint for industrialized killing found its first mobile prototype. The origins of the gas van can be traced to earlier Nazi experiments in mass killing. During the so-called T4 euthanasia program in Germany, medical personnel had pioneered gassing techniques on the mentally ill and disabled. Stationary gas chambers were used, often disguised as shower rooms, where carbon monoxide cylinders suffocated victims. Engineers who had worked on this program adapted their methods for mobile use in occupied Poland. Chelmno became the testing ground, where vans were modified by the Reich Main Security Office's technical department. These vehicles were engineered to appear unremarkable, with no external markings betraying their true purpose. They could blend into roads filled with military convoys and supply trucks. Their adaptability allowed them to operate discreetly, moving between the manor and the forest burial grounds. This mobility meant mass killing no longer required permanent facilities, only a vehicle and a willing crew. For the perpetrators, this innovation provided secrecy, efficiency, and the ability to kill in motion. For the victims, it created confusion and robbed them of any chance of resistance. And for history, it symbolized the mechanization of genocide. At Chelmno, 3 gas vans formed the core of extermination operations. Each van could carry between 50 and 70 people, packed tightly together with no space to sit. Families were herded inside, pressed shoulder to shoulder, suffocating even before the exhaust began. Once the doors slammed shut, the driver revved the engine, forcing exhaust fumes into the sealed compartment. The ride to the forest became both journey and execution, a grim dual purpose. Victims screamed, clawed at the metal walls and pounded on the doors, their cries muffled by the roar of the motor. Guards outside smoked or conversed, accustomed to the routine of death. By the time the van reached the graves, silence reigned inside. When the doors opened, a rush of fumes spilled out, followed by bodies piled in grotesque contortions. Prisoner laborers were ordered to unload the corpses, stripping them of any remaining valuables. The vehicle was then washed out, sometimes with hoses, before returning for another load. This cycle repeated multiple times a day, turning each van into a conveyor belt of annihilation. And in its repetition lay the efficiency the Nazis sought. The process was deliberately shrouded in deception to minimize resistance. Victims were told they were being transported to labor sites or relocated to new settlements. Guards encouraged them to carry small bags of belongings, heightening the illusion of resettlement. Once inside the vans, the victims still believed they were merely being driven to another camp. The rising heat and choking air were at first dismissed as discomfort, but as minutes passed, panic set in, with children crying, parents gasping, and the weak collapsing. This psychological manipulation ensured that most entered the vans without resistance. The SS relied on lies rather than brute force to control large groups. The victims' hope, cruelly nurtured until the very last moment, became a weapon against them. Even after suffocation, families often remained locked in desperate embraces, a final testament to their humanity. The Nazis used this illusion of safety to streamline murder with minimal disruption, and in this deception, the gas vans became not just machines of death, but instruments of psychological cruelty. The gas vans were not without their problems, and these flaws revealed the crude brutality of their design. Drivers sometimes complained of mechanical breakdowns, clogged exhaust systems, or bodies becoming lodged against doors. The vans themselves reeked of fumes and decomposition, creating unbearable working conditions for crews. In winter, cold weather made engines stall, prolonging suffocation and causing additional suffering for victims. In summer, the heat intensified the agony, accelerating suffocation but also making unloading more gruesome. Corpses often bled, vomited, or defecated during death, leaving the interiors filthy after each trip. Prisoner laborers had to clean the vans under guard supervision, an ordeal that compounded their torment. Despite these difficulties, the vans continued operating because they were effective enough for the camp's goals. The imperfections revealed the chilling indifference of the perpetrators, who saw technical glitches as problems of efficiency, not morality. Complaints were logged in reports, as if the vans were malfunctioning machines, not murder chambers. And these cold assessments underscored how killing had become an industrial process. Human lives were reduced to technical challenges to be solved. Chelmno's gas vans were also a proving ground for broader extermination policies. The lessons learned here informed the development of stationary gas chambers in camps like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. SS commanders noted that the vans could not keep pace with the scale of killing demanded by the final solution. Their limited capacity and mechanical flaws meant they were better suited to smaller extermination sites. But their psychological and operational framework, deception, confinement, suffocation, and disposal, was replicated on a larger scale in stationary facilities. Chelmno, therefore, functioned as a laboratory for genocide. Its vans were prototypes whose weaknesses would inspire more efficient methods. Yet for the thousands murdered within their steel confines, these vehicles were already instruments of industrial death. They revealed the Nazis' determination to refine extermination until it became seamless. And in their grim legacy, the vans bridged the gap between experimentation and full-scale genocide. Chelmno showed that mobility could murder, but permanence could annihilate millions. This progression marked the evolution of killing technology in the Holocaust, and it began with the rumble of engines in a Polish forest. The men who operated these vans embodied the corruption of conscience that defined the perpetrators. Drivers, mechanics, and SS guards treated the task as routine, complaining more about stench and technical issues than the murder itself. Some drank heavily to numb themselves, while others displayed casual cruelty, joking about their victims. Their reports framed the deaths in mechanical terms: how long suffocation took, how well engines worked, how quickly bodies were unloaded. Such language stripped away humanity, replacing lives with statistics. Prisoner laborers, meanwhile, endured the unbearable task of dragging corpses from the vans. They were forced to witness the repeated murder of men, women, and children, knowing their own deaths would soon follow. The SS ensured these units were rotated and executed to prevent survivors from revealing the camp's methods. Yet despite this secrecy, fragments of testimony survived, preserving the memory of the van's horror. The operators reduced genocide to a logistical problem, and in doing so revealed their complete moral collapse. Chelmno's gas vans turned human beings into cargo, and their operators became drivers of death. In historical memory, Chelmno's gas vans stand as the first fully realized instruments of mechanized extermination. They marked the shift from ad hoc shootings and local massacres to a systematic engineered process. The vans blurred the line between transportation and execution, reducing murder to a routine journey. For the victims, the experience was a nightmare of deception, claustrophobia, and suffocation. For the perpetrators, it was a test of organization, efficiency, and technical control. Their existence revealed the Nazis' obsession with creating machines that could kill en masse while sparing the executioners direct involvement. Chelmno's vans may have lacked the scale of later death camps, but they pioneered the method. They were prototypes that demonstrated how industrial systems could be applied to annihilation. And in their steel compartments, the future of genocide was born. The rumbling engines and suffocating fumes of Chelmno foreshadowed the gas chambers that would follow. The vans were not an aberration, but a blueprint, and in their dreadful design, they embodied the terrifying efficiency of the Nazi vision of extermination. In early December 1941, the machinery of Chelmno was tested for the first time with the arrival of its first victims. The initial transports came not from distant cities, but from nearby towns and villages in the Warthagal region of occupied Poland. These included Jews from places like Kowal, Dąbie, and the surrounding countryside. People who had already endured ghettoization and the stripping away of their rights. Deceived with promises of relocation to labor camps, they were ordered to pack belongings and assemble for transport. German officials told them they were being resettled, a euphemism that concealed their true fate. Families carried bundles of food, clothing, and personal treasures, unaware they would never see them again. Trucks and wagons collected them under SS supervision, accompanied by local collaborators. The journey to Chelmno was short, lasting only a few hours at most, but its significance was immeasurable. It marked the moment when the extermination camp transitioned from planning to execution. For the Nazis, this was a test of logistics, secrecy, and killing technology. For the victims, it was the beginning of the end. And for history, it signaled the opening of the first chapter in the Holocaust's industrial annihilation. Upon arrival at Chelmno, the victims were brought to the manor house, which served as the administrative and deceptive staging ground. Here the SS implemented their carefully crafted ruse of resettlement. Men, women, and children were ordered to disembark and told they would undergo medical examinations before being assigned to new work. The luggage they carried was collected, sorted, and looted, destined for use by Germans in the Reich. Victims were stripped of jewelry, money, and valuables, their possessions becoming part of the spoils of genocide. The SS deliberately maintained order, using calm tones to encourage compliance and minimize resistance. Groups were ushered inside the manor under the guise of registration, while others waited in barns or courtyards. The routine seemed orderly, almost bureaucratic, but behind the scenes the vans were already prepared. Victims believed this was the prelude to relocation, not realizing that death was only minutes away. The deception allowed the SS to process hundreds without violent outbreaks. This system of lies, combined with ruthless efficiency, would define Chelmno's operations, and the first victims walked into the trap with no reason to suspect their imminent fate. The gas vans, freshly delivered and modified, stood hidden behind the manor, ready to conduct their grisly work. Victims were ordered into the courtyard in groups, told they were being sent to another location for labor. Guards instructed them to climb inside the vehicles, presenting it as transport to the next stage. The compartments were sealed shut, leaving families pressed together in suffocating darkness. Engines roared to life, and within moments exhaust fumes began filling the chamber. The passengers coughed, gasped, and panicked as oxygen vanished from the air. Children cried and clung to parents, while adults clawed desperately at the steel walls. In less than 15 minutes, most inside lost consciousness, collapsing onto each other in grotesque heaps. The sound of pounding on the doors gave way to silence, leaving only the vibration of the truck. When the van rolled toward the forest, its cargo was already lifeless. Chelmno's system of mobile extermination had claimed its first lives, and with chilling efficiency, the Nazis had demonstrated that mass murder could be conducted without firing a shot. The first victims were unloaded in the forest of WW2, a short distance from the manor. Prisoner laborers, themselves doomed to eventual death, were forced to drag the corpses from the vans. Bodies were stripped of remaining clothing, valuables, or hidden belongings before being disposed of. Initially, mass graves were dug in the sandy soil, wide trenches into which the dead were piled layer upon layer. The forest, once tranquil, became a burial ground, its silence shattered by the constant unloading of the dead. The SS supervised every step, ensuring no valuables were overlooked, and no prisoner dared resist. Guards viewed the victims not as human beings, but as objects in a process. The disposal was treated as routine, with strict orders to maintain efficiency. The laborers, horrified by what they witnessed, obeyed under the threat of immediate execution. The graves grew rapidly, their scale dwarfing anything seen before. The ground itself became saturated with death, and the forest of Chelmno was transformed into an open-air cemetery of genocide. For the SS, these early operations were a grim rehearsal, and their reports reveal a cold detachment in describing them. They noted how long it took for suffocation to occur, how many bodies each van could carry, and how effectively the deception prevented disorder. To the perpetrators, the victims were reduced to numbers, statistics in the efficiency of extermination. Complaints about technical issues overshadowed any acknowledgement of human suffering. Engines sometimes stalled, prolonging suffocation, or exhaust systems failed to seal properly. Guards complained of the stench, of vomit and blood that covered the van interiors, requiring constant cleaning. Yet the tone remained clinical, as if these were logistical problems in a factory. The SS concluded that despite flaws, the vans fulfilled their purpose. The experiment had succeeded. Chelmno could kill efficiently, discreetly, and repeatedly. What began as a trial became a template, and the victims of December 1941 had become the test subjects for the Nazi vision of mechanized genocide. The impact on the victims' communities was immediate and devastating. Families from Domby and other towns vanished almost overnight. Homes were left empty, possessions confiscated, and entire neighborhoods erased from existence. Survivors in nearby ghettos whispered of disappearances, but could not comprehend the scale of what had occurred. Some believed their relatives had been sent to labor camps farther east. Others clung to rumors of resettlement, refusing to accept the possibility of extermination. The Nazis fostered this confusion, deliberately obscuring the fate of those deported to Chelmno. Fear spread through the ghettos, yet hope persisted, a fragile shield against the unimaginable. Only fragments of information leaked out from escapees or locals who witnessed the vans. But few wanted to believe such monstrous acts were possible. And thus, even as Chelmno claimed its first victims, the larger Jewish population remained ensnared in uncertainty and denial. The psychological impact on prisoner laborers forced to handle the corpses was profound. These men, often selected from arriving transports, were trapped in a cycle of complicity and terror. They lived in constant fear, knowing their turn would come once they were no longer useful. Every day they dragged lifeless bodies, cleaned out gas vans, and buried or burned evidence. They watched the faces of neighbors, relatives, and strangers alike, all murdered before their eyes. Their humanity was assaulted, their will to resist crushed by exhaustion and despair. Some tried to retain fragments of dignity by secretly recording names or burying tokens of remembrance. Others succumbed to numbness, surviving only by shutting off their emotions. The SS exploited their vulnerability, rotating them to ensure no witnesses lived long. Yet in their suffering, they bore silent witness to Chelmno's crimes, and their forced labor became part of the camp's machinery of death. The December 1941 killings at Chelmno were not a one-time atrocity, but the opening act of systematic annihilation. In those first weeks, thousands of Jews were murdered, their deaths serving as proof of concept for the Nazi program. The gas vans proved functional, the deception successful, and the disposal methods workable. From this point forward, Chelmno became an extermination factory, its routine refined and scaled. The first victims, nameless in German records, were test cases in a new form of industrial killing. They revealed how genocide could be cloaked in bureaucracy, disguised as relocation, and carried out with chilling efficiency. For the perpetrators, the process was deemed a success, a model to replicate elsewhere. For the victims, it was an incomprehensible betrayal of trust, hope, and humanity. Their deaths opened the floodgates to mass extermination across occupied Europe, and Chelmno's legacy began with the silent graves of those first who perished in its vans. By early 1942, the Łódź Ghetto, the second largest Jewish ghetto in Europe after Warsaw, had become a central target of Chelmno's operations. Located only about 40 miles away, Łódź held nearly 200,000 Jews crammed into appalling conditions. Initially, the ghetto had been preserved for forced labor, with its workshops producing textiles and other goods for the German war economy. But with the acceleration of the final solution, the Nazi leadership decreed that even these workers were expendable. Heinrich Himmler and local officials coordinated to liquidate sections of the ghetto, funneling its inhabitants to Chelmno. The proximity made the camp the perfect killing ground, hidden in the forests but close enough for efficient transport. Jews of Łódź were rounded up in mass actions, often under the pretense of resettlement to labor camps in the east. German and auxiliary police surrounded the ghetto, tearing families from their homes in brutal raids. Children, the elderly, and the infirm were especially targeted, deemed unfit for work, and therefore first in line for deportation. Packed into cattle cars, they were transported under appalling conditions. and their destination was not a new labor assignment but immediate death in the gas vans of Chelmno. The liquidation began in January 1942, a process carried out with calculated speed and ruthless precision. Deportations were organized in waves, with thousands of people forced onto trains at the Radegast station on the outskirts of the ghetto. The station, once a mundane site of transport, became the launching point for destruction, its tracks carrying countless victims to Chelmno. Victims often believed they were bound for agricultural colonies or camps further east, illusions deliberately maintained by German propaganda. The Judenrat, the ghetto's Jewish council, was coerced into assisting with the deportation lists, creating unbearable moral dilemmas. For the SS, this cooperation masked the operation's true nature, preventing panic. For the victims, the false hope softened resistance, even as rumors of killings began to circulate. Trains rolled out daily, each freight car packed with human lives stripped of freedom. At Chelmno, they were met with the same cruel deception of resettlement and medical checks. Within hours of leaving their homes in Łódź, thousands were lying lifeless in forest graves, and thus the ghetto's liquidation was directly tethered to Chelmno's machinery of death. Inside the ghetto, terror grew as deportations became a regular part of life. Families hid children in cellars, attics, and concealed bunkers, hoping to spare them from deportation. But German searches were merciless, dragging even the youngest from their hiding places. Rumors spread of disappearances, whispered stories of gas vans and death in the forests. Yet many clung to the belief that deportees were alive somewhere else, clinging to fragile illusions of survival. The ghetto's leaders, including Szym Rumkowski, faced impossible choices under Nazi orders. When told to supply lists of children and the elderly, Rumkowski's infamous plea, "Give me your children," echoed through the community with unbearable despair. He justified it as a way to save others, but in truth it was a choice imposed by the Nazis' cruelty. Parents wept as children were torn from their arms, a trauma that scarred survivors forever. The ghetto's population shrank rapidly, with wave after wave disappearing into Chelmno's gas vans. In just a few months, tens of thousands were erased, and the ghetto itself became a holding pen for those awaiting their turn in line. At Chelmno, the transports from Łódź brought new logistical challenges for the SS. The sheer scale of deportations overwhelmed the camp's capacity to process bodies. Vans made multiple trips each day, driving between the manor house and the forest clearing. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, forcing prisoner laborers into relentless work. Mass graves expanded, and trenches widened, as thousands were dumped into sandy pits. The forest floor turned into a grotesque landscape of death, scarred by endless burials. The SS sought to maintain secrecy, ordering local villagers not to enter the woods. Yet the stench carried for miles, and the sight of vans passing regularly aroused suspicion. Still, terror and Nazi power silenced most witnesses. For the perpetrators, this was efficiency at work. For the victims, it was annihilation at unimaginable speed. And Chelmno became the silent partner in the destruction of the Łódź ghetto. The connection between Łódź and Chelmno revealed the systematic coordination of Nazi genocide. It was not a chaotic series of random killings, but a bureaucratically organized program. Every transport was documented, every deportee counted, every possession inventoried. German railway officials scheduled trains as if they were shipments of freight, reducing human lives to numbers and timetables. SS officers at Chelmno filed reports on van operations, recording successes in terms of bodies processed. Local administrators in Łódź balanced labor needs against extermination quotas, prolonging the ghetto's existence for work, while feeding Chelmno with those deemed unfit. Even ordinary Germans were implicated, from railway workers to clerks who managed paperwork. This web of complicity ensured the machine of death operated smoothly. The line from ghetto to camp was seamless, a conveyor belt of destruction. The extermination of Łódź Jews was not the work of a few monsters, but of an entire system, and Chelmno stood at the end of that system as its terminal point. The experience of deportees from Łódź was particularly tragic because many had survived years of ghettoization. They had endured starvation, disease, forced labor, and brutality, only to be sent to Chelmno in the final stage. Families who had managed to cling to life in the ghetto's workshops were suddenly uprooted. Children who had been hidden for years were dragged into the open and deported. The ghetto's schools, secret synagogues, and cultural life, all painstakingly maintained under oppression, were extinguished. The deportations shattered what little community bonds remained. In Chelmno, no trace of individuality was preserved. People were stripped, suffocated, and dumped without record. For many, their final moments were ones of confusion, disbelief, and terror. The long years of suffering in Łódź ended not in liberation, but in the suffocating darkness of a gas van. This cruel irony underscores the horror of Chelmno's role. It was the final thief of hope for tens of thousands who had already lost everything. And in this way, the camp became inseparably linked to the destruction of the Łódź ghetto. By the summer of 1942, the Łódź deportations had reached catastrophic proportions. Estimates suggest that over 55,000 Jews were deported from the ghetto to Chelmno in that year alone. Entire neighborhoods were emptied, with families vanished in the span of weeks. The ghetto's population dwindled to a fraction of its former size. For those who remained, the atmosphere was one of constant dread, waiting for the next action. Chelmno consumed these lives in a mechanical cycle of deception, suffocation, and disposal. The ghetto, meanwhile, became quieter, its streets emptying as its heart was ripped out. Even the most optimistic could no longer deny that deportation meant death. Survivors later recalled the silence of once crowded courtyards and the emptiness of schools where children had been seized. The deportations continued until only a remnant population remained for labor, and the link between Chelmno and the ghetto had done its grim work, erasing tens of thousands in months. The liquidation of the Łódź ghetto through Chelmno marked a turning point in the Holocaust. It demonstrated the Nazis' ability to destroy entire urban communities with speed and secrecy. It showed how ghettos, once designed for segregation and exploitation, could be emptied into extermination camps. The connection also highlighted the interplay between deception and compliance, as victims believed in resettlement even as their neighbors disappeared. For the SS, it was proof of the system's efficiency. For the Jewish community, it was the obliteration of one of Europe's great centers of life. Chelmno, though less remembered than Auschwitz or Treblinka, became the graveyard for the Jews of Łódź. It stood as a precursor to even larger operations, showing how gas vans could be scaled to destroy entire populations. The forest graves of Chelmno filled with the voices of those who once sang, studied, and worked in Łódź. Their erasure was both physical and cultural, a wound that would never fully heal. And in this chapter of destruction, the name Chelmno became forever tied to the tragedy of the Łódź ghetto. From the very first moment of arrival at Chelmno, deception was the central weapon of the Nazis. The victims, exhausted after a long and brutal journey in sealed cattle cars, were told they had arrived at a transit point for resettlement. SS officers, wearing polished uniforms and adopting a tone of false authority, reassured them that they would soon be assigned to new labor sites. Signboards were placed strategically, creating the illusion of a functioning transit station. In some instances, the Germans even used interpreters to explain the resettlement procedure, ensuring the message was understood in Yiddish, Polish, or German. Prisoners were told to line up calmly, leave their belongings for collection, and prepare for hygiene measures. The SS cultivated an atmosphere of order and control so as to prevent panic. Families, clinging to a fragile hope of survival, obeyed these instructions despite their fears. Even the guards' barked commands were carefully calibrated, not too brutal at this stage, lest chaos break out. What awaited the victims was carefully hidden behind layers of bureaucratic theatre, and deception smoothed the path to death with chilling efficiency. The process continued with the confiscation of possessions, which was disguised as a necessary part of resettlement. Victims were instructed to leave their luggage in neat piles, often told that their belongings would be delivered to them later. This false assurance persuaded many to part with the last remnants of their lives without resistance. Money, jewelry, clothing, and personal keepsakes were all catalogued by the SS and later sorted by prisoner labor units. The looting was so systematic that warehouses were established to process the stolen goods. Items were shipped back to Germany, where ordinary citizens received parcels of clothing, shoes, and kitchen utensils from the murdered. To the victims, this process seemed temporary, a step on the way to a new home. Yet each suitcase left behind was, in truth, a coffin of memory, never to be reclaimed. Mothers tucked children's toys into bags, fathers folded work tools, all believing they would need them again. The deception turned trust into compliance, making resistance almost impossible, and every neatly stacked suitcase was another silent victory for the machinery of death. After surrendering their belongings, victims were led toward the manor house or forest clearing under the guise of medical procedures. They were told they must undergo disinfection and showering before continuing their journey. The language used, cleanliness, hygiene, inspection, was familiar from earlier ghetto regulations, giving the appearance of bureaucratic normalcy. SS men repeated the lies with practiced indifference, while guards prodded people forward. At the undressing area, victims were instructed to remove their clothing, sometimes under the pretense that it would be laundered. Men, women, and children were stripped of the last layer of dignity, reduced to naked vulnerability in the cold. Fear rippled through the crowd, but the constant repetition of falsehoods prevented outright panic. Many still believed they would emerge from the procedure alive. In fact, the undressing served only two purposes: humiliation and efficiency in extermination. Clothing was collected, sorted, and packed for shipment. Bodies would later be easier to handle without garments. And in this carefully staged deception, the line between life and death was erased under a mask of routine. The architecture of deception extended to the vehicles themselves. The gas vans that became Chelmno's primary killing tool. To the victims, these vehicles appeared to be ordinary transport trucks, supposedly meant to carry them to labor camps or new housing areas. Painted grey or green, with innocuous markings, the vans raised no immediate suspicion. SS guards told victims they would be driven a short distance to work sites or to proper bathing facilities. The interior of the van, fitted with steel floors and hidden exhaust pipes, was kept secret until the doors closed. Prisoners were packed tightly inside, often reassured with promises that the ride would be brief. Children were calmed by parents, who themselves clung to the hope of survival. Once the doors sealed, the van became a mobile gas chamber, suffocating its occupants with carbon monoxide. The journey to the forest thus became a death march on wheels. Victims only realized the truth when breathing became impossible, but by then escape was futile, and the SS could present the process as nothing more than another stage in resettlement. The psychological manipulation at Chelmno was as deadly as the gas vans themselves. The Nazis understood that chaos, panic, or rebellion could disrupt their killing process. By maintaining a facade of order and resettlement, they transformed thousands into passive victims. This manipulation exploited the natural instinct to hope even in the face of despair. Parents reassured children that they were simply being moved to a better place, unknowingly repeating the Nazis' own lies. Elders urged calm, believing that obedience might spare them from the worst. Every small act of compliance born of deception smoothed the path to annihilation. The SS did not need to use overwhelming violence at this stage. Words, symbols, and false promises did the work for them. Guards became actors in a grotesque performance, staging a play whose final act was death. The efficiency of the system depended on this psychological stranglehold, and Chelmno perfected it to a chilling degree, making murder appear as resettlement until the very last breath. Deception was also reinforced by the physical layout of the camp. The path from unloading to undressing to the gas vans was carefully designed to appear logical and mundane. Signs marked supposed destinations, with arrows guiding the flow of people. The manor house functioned as a bureaucratic facade, where offices and inspection rooms reinforced the illusion of processing. The forest path, leading to the burial pits, was hidden from view by fences and foliage. Even the sounds of engines starting and vans rumbling away could be mistaken for ordinary transport. Prisoner labor units forced into service were instructed to maintain the illusion, telling new arrivals to stay calm. The environment itself became part of the deception, with every building and clearing serving a dual purpose. To the victims, the camp resembled a temporary transit site. To the SS, it was a stage for mass killing, constructed to prevent resistance. And in this twisted design, architecture itself became a tool of murder. The role of the SS in maintaining deception cannot be overstated. Officers gave orders with cold authority, using their uniforms as symbols of legitimacy. Their demeanor often oscillated between calm instruction and sudden brutality, a psychological tactic to keep victims disoriented. Guards shouted commands about hygiene, work, and resettlement, repeating lies until they became routine. Each word was chosen to mask the reality of extermination. Prisoners who questioned the process were beaten or killed, their deaths serving as warnings to others. Yet most obeyed, lulled into submission by the appearance of organization. Even the smallest details, such as the collection of shoes in orderly piles, reinforced the illusion. The SS orchestrated every movement as if directing a play, with deception as the central script. And by the time the curtain fell, the victims had been silenced forever. The perpetrators then reset the stage for the next transport, repeating the cycle of lies and death. The machinery of deception at Chelmno was not an accident, but a deliberate system perfected through practice. From the first transports to the liquidation of entire ghettos, the SS refined their lies into a weapon. They learned how to disguise fear with false promises, how to manipulate families into cooperation, how to exploit the hope of survival. This machinery was as vital as the gas vans themselves, for without it resistance would have been more frequent. Chelmno became a prototype of genocide precisely because it demonstrated the power of deception in mass killing. It showed how propaganda, authority, and ritual could transform a massacre into a silent process. Victims walked themselves into death, believing until the final moments that life still awaited. Their last possessions were neatly looted, their final words lost in the suffocating vans. The SS emerged not as warriors, but as murderers hidden behind lies. The forest graves filled silently, each one sealed by deception, and the machinery of lies at Chelmno became a template for every extermination camp that followed. Beyond the manor house of Chelmno lay a vast, quiet forest that became the camp's true killing ground. At first glance, it was a tranquil landscape of trees, birdsong, and winding paths, seemingly untouched by human cruelty. But beneath the surface, this forest became a graveyard for tens of thousands. The gas vans, once filled with victims, rumbled down hidden dirt tracks into its depths. There, in remote clearings, the SS had prepared massive pits dug by forced labourers. These trenches, sometimes stretching over 50 meters long and several meters deep, became mass graves for entire communities. Victims were dumped into them in layers, one transport after another, until the ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of death. The forest soil absorbed the fluids of decomposition, releasing a stench that hung in the air for miles. Local villagers reported the nauseating odor, though fear silenced most of them. For the SS, the forest provided both concealment and convenience, and for the victims, it became the final silent witness to their erasure. The digging of graves was itself an act of cruelty imposed on prisoners. Special labor detachments, known as the Sonderkommando, were forced to excavate vast pits under the constant gaze of armed guards. These men, already weakened by starvation and brutal treatment, were compelled to prepare the earth for the corpses of their fellow Jews. The SS deliberately used them in this gruesome work, knowing it would break their spirits and tether them to the killing process. Once the vans arrived, the Sonderkommando were ordered to unload the bodies, stacking them neatly or tossing them without ceremony, depending on the officer's mood. The laborers themselves knew their own lives were temporary, destined to end once their usefulness expired. Their suffering was compounded by the fact that they often recognized relatives or neighbors among the dead. At night, under dim light, they were forced to fill in the pits with soil, covering layer upon layer of corpses. The earth sagged under its burden, sometimes collapsing as gases built up from decomposition. In these pits, the line between work and torment blurred, and each spade of soil buried not just bodies, but fragments of humanity. The process of burial was carried out with chilling regularity. After each transport was gassed, the van drove into the forest, where its rear doors opened to reveal a suffocating pile of bodies. Sonderkommando prisoners dragged out the corpses, often still warm, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Women, children, the elderly, all were mixed together without distinction. Sometimes, SS officers forced prisoners to arrange bodies in rows, as though even in death efficiency mattered. The piles grew higher, filling the pits faster than new ones could be dug. When a grave was filled, it was covered with lime and soil to accelerate decomposition. But the smell could not be contained, and animals sometimes disturbed the sites. Villagers reported seeing human remains protruding from freshly dug earth, grisly reminders of the horror hidden in the forest. Still, the SS continued, indifferent to the evidence. Each day the forest swallowed more lives, and with each burial, Chelmno tightened its grip as a factory of death. By mid-1942, the scale of killing had overwhelmed even this system of burial. The graves filled too quickly, and the stench became impossible to ignore. More importantly, Nazi officials feared that mass graves would one day serve as evidence of their crimes. Orders came from Berlin to eliminate all physical traces of the exterminations. At Chelmno, this meant the beginning of large-scale cremation in the forest itself. Open-air pyres were constructed, using iron rails laid across brick foundations. Bodies were exhumed from the pits and stacked like firewood, layer upon layer, interspersed with logs. Gasoline was poured over the heaps, and flames consumed the remains. The work was again forced upon Sonderkommando prisoners, who endured the unbearable task of burning corpses of their own people. Ashes were then scattered or reburied, further obscuring the evidence, and thus the forest was transformed from a place of burial to a furnace of annihilation. The cremation process was grueling, both physically and psychologically. Bodies had to be dragged from decomposing graves, their flesh bloated and often unrecognizable. Prisoners gagged on the stench, while SS officers laughed or smoked cigarettes nearby, treating the spectacle as routine. Corpses were stripped of gold teeth before burning, another layer of plunder in the machinery of death. The fires burned day and night, visible from nearby villages as columns of smoke rose above the treetops. Locals whispered of strange bonfires in the woods, though few dared to investigate. The laborers were forced to stir the piles to ensure complete burning, using long hooks to reposition limbs. Ashes clogged the air, coating the prisoners in a grey dust that clung to skin and hair. Each cycle of cremation destroyed thousands of lives in silence. And yet the SS saw it as a triumph of efficiency, the perfect erasure of their crimes. For the forest it was another wound, its soil now saturated, not just with blood but with ashes. The decision to cremate was also part of the broader Nazi effort known as Aktion 1005, the program to erase evidence of mass killings. Chelmno became one of the first sites where this policy was rigorously applied. The SS sought to leave behind nothing but empty pits and scorched earth. Yet no amount of cremation could erase the memory of the forest. Survivors later described the strange silence that lingered, broken only by the crackling of flames and the groans of prisoners forced to feed the fires. The cremation pits themselves became scenes of grotesque spectacle, with mountains of bodies set alight in ritualized destruction. Smoke darkened the skies, carrying with it the final traces of thousands of souls. Even when the fires died, the ground remained littered with bone fragments and ashes. Farmers ploughing nearby fields sometimes uncovered human remains years later. The attempt at erasure was futile, for the earth itself remembered, and Chelmno's forest became both grave and witness. The forest thus evolved into the very heart of Chelmno's killing process. It was here that deception ended, and the full reality of extermination was revealed. To the SS, the forest was a tool, isolated, concealed, efficient to the victims. It was a place of terror, their last sight of the world before suffocation claimed them. For the Sonderkommando, it was a place of endless torment, where each day meant handling the corpses of neighbors, relatives, or strangers bound by the same fate. The forest absorbed screams, smoke, and silence alike, holding them in its soil and roots. The trees bore witness, their trunks scorched by cremation fires, their roots tangled with the dead. Birds fled the area, leaving an unnatural stillness in their place. And though the Nazis sought to hide their crimes, the forest became a permanent archive of death. Every path, every pit, every clearing carried the weight of what had happened. And for those who survived, the memory of Chelmno's forest never faded. The transformation of a peaceful forest into a cemetery of unimaginable scale remains one of Chelmno's most haunting legacies. It demonstrated the Nazis' ability to weaponize even nature itself, turning landscapes into instruments of genocide. The forest that once sheltered life became a space designed for mass death. Graves swallowed thousands, fires consumed bodies, and ashes mingled with soil and streams. Yet, despite the Nazis' desperate attempts to erase their deeds, the truth could not be hidden forever. Survivors carried the memory, and investigators later uncovered the remnants, charred bones, ash, and soil stained with blood. For historians, the forest of Chelmno stands as a testament to the scale and secrecy of early extermination. For humanity, it is a reminder of how ordinary places can be transformed into theaters of atrocity. The The stillness of those woods today conceals the cries of the past, but silence itself has become part of the testimony. Chelmno's forest was not just a backdrop, it was the final resting place of tens of thousands, and in its soil lies the memory of one of history's first great factories of death. Among the darkest aspects of Chelmno's operation was the creation of special prisoner units known as the Sonderkommando. These men were not ordinary inmates of the camp, but captives singled out by the SS for gruesome duties. Their task was to handle the very machinery of death, dragging corpses from the gas vans, burying them in forest pits, or later feeding them into cremation fires. The SS exploited them as tools, forcing them to participate in the destruction of their own people. To the Germans, their role provided efficiency, as it spared the guards from physical labor, but to the prisoners themselves, it was a torment that stripped away their humanity while condemning them to eventual execution. They were never intended to survive, only to extend the life of the killing system. Their existence was shrouded in secrecy, as no witnesses to the extermination process were meant to remain alive. Every new group of Sonderkommando knew that their time was limited. When their strength waned, or when their knowledge became too great, they too would be murdered. And in this cruel cycle, the Sonderkommando became both victims and unwilling participants in Chelmno's crimes. The daily tasks imposed on these men defy comprehension. When the gas vans arrived at the forest clearings, the Sonderkommando were ordered to open the heavy doors. Inside, bodies tumbled out, often still warm, their faces twisted in terror. The prisoners had to pull them free, arrange them into piles, and drag them to the waiting pits. Corpses were heavy, stiff, and sometimes entangled, making the work physically unbearable. Yet SS guards whipped and beat the men to maintain speed, treating any hesitation as sabotage. Later, when cremation replaced burial, the work became even more grotesque. Prisoners had to exhume decomposed bodies, swollen with gas and fluids, and stack them onto pyres. The smell of rot and burning flesh clung to their skin, searing itself into memory. To survive meant to endure a living nightmare with no escape, and every day brought them closer to the moment when they too would be killed to silence what they had seen. The psychological torment of the Sonderkommando was as devastating as the physical labor. Many recognized relatives, neighbors, or even their own children among the bodies they handled. The SS forced them into this position deliberately, knowing it broke their spirits and deepened their suffering. Prisoners whispered prayers as they dragged corpses, trying to offer dignity in a place designed to erase it. Some closed the eyes of the dead, or positioned bodies more gently, small acts of humanity in a world stripped of compassion. But these gestures were seen as defiance, punished with violence if noticed. The men lived in constant fear, not only of guards, but of the unbearable weight of conscience. They knew they were performing tasks that would haunt them forever, yet they also knew refusal meant instant execution. Survival depended on obeying orders while silently grieving every life they touched. And this unbearable moral burden became another weapon in the Nazis' arsenal of cruelty. The Sonderkommando lived separately from other prisoners, isolated in makeshift barracks under tight guard. Their isolation was meant to prevent contact with outsiders who might learn of the camp's true purpose. Food was scarce and conditions brutal, but the psychological isolation was even worse. They were forbidden from speaking openly, forced to carry out their duties in silence. At night, the men returned from the forest coated in ash and blood, collapsing into exhausted heaps. Whispers among them carried the only consolation, shared grief that bound them together. Some attempted to form bonds, offering fragments of comfort in the face of certain death. Others withdrew into themselves, numb from the horrors they endured. The SS deliberately rotated groups, ensuring no Sonderkommando survived long enough to spread the truth. For the prisoners, every dawn was both a reprieve and a death sentence delayed, and the barracks themselves became silent chambers of despair, housing men broken by unspeakable tasks. The SS controlled the Sonderkommando with calculated terror. Guards would execute men at random, reinforcing the lesson that their lives held no value. Rumors of impending liquidation kept the prisoners in constant dread. Some groups lasted only weeks before being replaced by new arrivals from incoming transports. Others were destroyed wholesale, their barracks burned after mass executions. The SS saw them as disposable tools, not human beings. Occasionally, prisoners attempted resistance, sabotaging tasks in small ways, burying bodies less neatly, damaging equipment, or leaving signs of defiance. But such acts were perilous, often punished by immediate execution. Still, these tiny rebellions represented a flicker of humanity within a system built on destruction. For the SS, the terrorization of Sonderkommando was both practical and sadistic. And for the prisoners, it was proof that even survival meant living in the shadow of inevitable death. One of the most harrowing aspects of Sonderkommando existence was the constant confrontation with the dead. Unlike prisoners in other camps, who might focus on survival through labor, these men faced death directly every hour of the day. They inhaled the stench of suffocation, handled lifeless limbs, and stared into faces frozen in agony. The line between life and death blurred as they walked among bodies with the knowledge that soon they would join them. Guards mocked them, calling them grave diggers of their own people. Some prisoners tried to numb themselves, treating the work mechanically. Others sought solace in faith, whispering psalms or muttering prayers under their breath. At times men broke down entirely, collapsing in grief or madness. The SS treated such moments with mockery or bullets, and through it all, the Sonderkommando bore the unbearable truth of Chelmno's horror, pressed into their very flesh and memory. Despite the torment, some Sonderkommando dared to dream of escape. A handful attempted to slip away into the forest during work details, though most were quickly caught and executed. In 1942, a small group succeeded in fleeing, later testifying about Chelmno's atrocities to resistance networks. Their testimonies were among the first evidence of the camp's true function. The very act of survival became a form of resistance, as the Nazis sought to obliterate all witnesses. Some prisoners secretly recorded details, carved marks into trees, or whispered truths to villagers when possible. These fragile acts of defiance preserved memory in a place designed for erasure. The SS understood the danger of such witnesses and intensified their efforts to annihilate them. Yet fragments of testimony survived, carried into the post-war years. Without the Sonderkommando, Chelmno might have remained a hidden crime, buried in its forest graves. Their suffering gave voice to the silenced dead, and in this way they defied their captors even as they perished. The fate of the Sonderkommando at Chelmno was almost always death. Once their usefulness ended, they were murdered like the victims they had been forced to handle. Their barracks were torched, their bodies disposed of, and their existence erased from records. Only a handful lived long enough to bear witness after the war. Their testimonies revealed the depth of cruelty, the precision of extermination, and the unbearable burden placed upon them. Historians today rely on these fragments to reconstruct Chelmno's operation, for the Nazis tried to obliterate every trace. The Sonderkommando embodied the most tragic paradox of the Holocaust: victims forced into complicity against their will. They were not collaborators but captives, enslaved in the very machinery of destruction. Their torment cannot be measured in numbers alone, but in the scars etched upon their souls. To remember them is to remember the cruelest face of Chelmno, and in their doomed existence the Sonderkommando became unwilling keepers of truth. At the heart of Chelmno's machinery of death stood its commandants, men whose names remain forever linked with cruelty and mass murder. The first commandant was SS officer Herbert Lang, a figure already experienced in killing operations before being assigned to Chelmno. Lang had overseen mobile killing squads during the infamous euthanasia programs in Germany, where the disabled and mentally ill were gassed in sealed vans. His transfer to Chelmno was no accident, for his expertise in using gas vans made him an ideal architect of the camp's extermination system. Lang embodied the Nazi idea of efficiency in murder, reducing genocide to technical procedure. He commanded with cold detachment, issuing orders that condemned tens of thousands to death. His staff feared him as much as they obeyed him, for his rage was sudden and merciless. Under Lang's watch, Chelmno began its grim operation in December 1941, targeting Jews from the Warthegau region. He viewed the victims not as human beings, but as objects to be disposed of quickly. His leadership ensured that Chelmno became a prototype for the wider final solution, and in him we see the chilling face of bureaucratic murder cloaked in the uniform of the SS. Following Lange's tenure came Hans Bothmann, another SS officer who would carry Chelmno into its most active phase of killing. Bothmann arrived in 1942 with orders to improve the camp's efficiency, a euphemism that meant refining the methods of mass extermination. Where Lange had established the system, Bothmann perfected its cruelty. He ordered the use of more advanced gas vans, tighter schedules of deportations, and harsher discipline for the Sonderkommando. Survivors recalled him as a man of brutality and arrogance, who showed no hesitation in killing with his own hands. Bothmann frequently carried a riding crop, striking prisoners as he barked orders, a symbol of his domination. He delighted in terror, staging executions in front of the Sonderkommando to remind them of their expendability. He also oversaw the shift from mass graves to open-air cremation, ensuring that evidence of Chelmno's crimes could be erased. His cruelty was both physical and psychological, designed to crush resistance before it could begin. Under Bothmann, Chelmno reached the height of its murderous efficiency, consuming lives at a pace that shocked even some of the SS. And in his hands the camp became not just a place of extermination, but of calculated sadism. The commandants were supported by a cadre of SS officers and guards whose cruelty completed the system. These men, often younger and less educated, carried out orders with unquestioning obedience. Many came from backgrounds steeped in Nazi ideology, trained in dehumanization and blind loyalty. They patrolled the camp's perimeters, drove the victims into gas vans, and oversaw the gruesome disposal of corpses. Names like Walter Piller and Ernst Sick surface in testimonies, men who carried out their tasks with chilling efficiency. They were not commanders, but their role was indispensable to the camp's function. These guards used beatings, whippings, and shootings as tools of discipline, ensuring prisoners remained paralyzed with fear. They treated Jews and Poles with contempt, often mocking them before death. For them, cruelty was not only a duty, but a perverse form of entertainment. In the forest clearing, they smoked cigarettes while bodies burned, an image of callousness that defies comprehension. And though history remembers them less than their commandants, their hands were equally stained with blood. Herbert Lang's personality revealed the convergence of ideology and pragmatism in the Nazi killing machine. He was not known for wild outbursts, but for cold efficiency, a man who turned extermination into administrative routine. He had been promoted through the ranks for his loyalty and his skill in suppressing Polish resistance. By the time he came to Chelmno, he already carried the weight of mass killings in his past. He understood gas vans not as instruments of horror, but as technical devices for solving a logistical problem. Witnesses described his ability to detach completely from the suffering he inflicted. To him, Jews were not neighbors or fellow human beings. They were targets of a state policy he embodied. He rarely questioned orders, instead relishing the authority they gave him. His presence at Chelmno was short but decisive, for he laid the foundation that ensured its murderous longevity. He was later killed on the Eastern Front, never facing justice for his crimes, but his shadow lingered in the blood-soaked soil of Chelmno, where his methods claimed tens of thousands of lives, and in his absence his successor carried on the work with even greater cruelty. Hans Bothmann was a different figure, remembered for his brutality and cruelty beyond even what was required by the system. He had fewer qualms about violence, often participating directly in shootings and beatings. His sadism set a tone for the entire camp, ensuring that terror was not just a byproduct of extermination, but a deliberate policy. Survivors recalled him mocking the condemned, taunting them about their imminent deaths. Unlike Lange, who projected bureaucratic coldness, Bothmann exuded a volatile menace. He demanded precision and speed, punishing even minor delays with whippings or executions. His legacy was also marked by his role in attempting to cover Chelmno's crimes. As Soviet forces approached in 1944, Bothmann supervised the burning of corpses, the dismantling of structures, and the silencing of prisoners. His efforts were aimed not at saving lives, but at erasing memory. He sought to destroy the evidence of Chelmno's existence, but fragments of testimony survived, sealing his place in history. After the war, Bothmann was captured and later took his own life before he could face trial. His suicide denied survivors the chance to confront him, but it did not erase the truth of his actions. In him we see the face of cruelty unchecked by conscience. The rank-and-file guards at Chelmno operated under the authority of these commandants, but also expressed their own personal brutality. Many were volunteers from the SS Totenkopfverbände, units accustomed to guarding concentration camps. Others were seconded from police forces, men who had long practiced repression in occupied territories. Their work was simple but horrific: drive victims into vans, close the doors, and then wait as the carbon monoxide suffocated them. Some guards mocked the victims, telling them they were being taken to showers or resettlement. Others maintained a detached silence, pretending indifference to the screams. Their cruelty extended to the Sonderkommando, whom they treated as less than human. Guards beat men who moved too slowly, shot those who faltered, and amused themselves by inventing new punishments. Their presence ensured the system ran with relentless terror. And though history records their names less frequently, their complicity was total. They were the hands that turned policy into death, day after day, without hesitation. And their absence of pity turned Chelmno into a theater of mechanized cruelty. The perpetrators at Chelmno justified their actions through ideology and obedience. They saw themselves as soldiers of the Reich, fulfilling their duty to cleanse Europe of what their leaders deemed undesirable. Some guards were deeply indoctrinated, convinced that Jews were subhuman and deserved extermination. Others were motivated by fear of disobedience, knowing that refusal could mean transfer to the front or punishment. But there were also those who embraced cruelty with relish, finding in it a sense of power. The killing fields of Chelmno became a place where moral boundaries dissolved, and ordinary men became architects of horror. The SS created an environment where violence was normalized and compassion was eradicated. Commandants like Lange and Bothmann reinforced this ethos, rewarding brutality while punishing hesitation. The system thrived on obedience, leaving little room for conscience. Yet history reminds us that these men were not automatons but individuals making choices. Their choices, however cloaked in ideology, turned forests into graveyards, and their decisions condemned entire communities to silence. The legacy of Chelmno's perpetrators is one of infamy and unanswered justice. Many of the guards escaped trial, blending back into post-war society, their crimes buried in secrecy. Some were eventually captured in the 1960s during renewed investigations into Nazi crimes. Trials in Germany exposed the details of Chelmno, bringing survivors' testimonies into the light. Lang was already dead, but Bothmann and others were named as architects of mass murder. Yet many sentences were light, and the enormity of their crimes seemed to dwarf the justice delivered. Still, their names are etched into history, remembered not for their power but for their cruelty. In understanding Chelmno, one cannot separate the machinery of death from the men who built and maintained it. They were not faceless instruments but living, breathing perpetrators who made conscious choices. Their crimes reveal how ideology, obedience, and sadism intertwined in the Holocaust. And by remembering them, we confront the human capacity for evil, embodied in the commandants and guards of Chelmno. Although Chelmno is remembered primarily as a site of Jewish annihilation, its reach extended further, ensnaring other groups targeted by Nazi racial ideology. Among these were the Roma, or so-called Gypsies, whom the regime viewed as racially inferior and socially undesirable. Entire Roma families from the Łódź Ghetto and surrounding regions were transported to Chelmno in early 1942. For them, the journey was particularly cruel, as many had already been displaced repeatedly, driven from villages and forced into camps. When the trucks carrying them arrived at Chelmno, they faced the same deceitful procedures as Jewish victims, promises of resettlement, disinfection, and work. Yet behind these lies awaited the gas vans, engines of suffocation disguised as transport. Roma survivors from elsewhere later testified to the speed with which families were separated and obliterated. For the Nazis, the extermination of Roma was part of their broader racial crusade, treating them as a social and beyond redemption. Chelmno thus became one of the first places where the Roma Holocaust, the Porojmos, was carried out with industrial efficiency. Thousands perished here in silence, without records, their graves hidden in the forests. And their destruction reflected the Nazis' obsessive drive to purge Europe of every group deemed unworthy of life. Polish non-Jews, too, fell victim to Chelmno's machinery of death. The Nazis viewed Poles as racially inferior Slavs, unfit to govern themselves, useful only as forced labor or destined for removal. Chelmno was not only a Jewish extermination site, but also a killing ground for members of the Polish intelligentsia, resistance fighters, and those accused of defiance. Teachers, priests, and community leaders were sometimes transported to Chelmno after arrest, their deaths intended as warnings to others. The camp's forest became a silent cemetery for countless Poles whose names were never recorded. Many of these killings occurred alongside Jewish deportations, blending into the mass of destruction but driven by a separate agenda. Nazi occupation policy sought to decapitate Polish society, erasing its cultural and political leaders. Chelmno became a tool for this policy, operating in tandem with mass shootings and deportations elsewhere. Survivors spoke of Poles who arrived bewildered, believing they faced prison or labor, only to find themselves swallowed by the same gas vans. Their destruction was less publicized but no less deliberate, a parallel genocide hidden within the larger machinery of mass death. In Chelmno's soil, the bones of Jews and Poles lay intermingled, bound by the same fate at the hands of their executioners. One of the most haunting groups sent to Chelmno were Soviet prisoners of war. Captured in vast numbers during the early German offensives in 1941, millions of Soviet POWs perished in camps through starvation, exposure, and shootings. but Chelmno too became part of this tragedy. Selected Soviet prisoners, especially Jews or political officers, were transported here for extermination. They were subjected to the same humiliating process of undressing and deception, stripped of dignity before being driven to their deaths. For the Nazis, these men symbolized the hated Bolshevik enemy, merging racial hatred with ideological fury. In the forest clearings, Soviet POWs were often forced into labor before being killed, compelled to dig graves for themselves and others. Some attempted resistance, but they were swiftly crushed by armed guards and SS overseers. The presence of Soviet POWs at Chelmno underscored the camp's function as a weapon not just of racial cleansing, but of ideological warfare. It reflected Hitler's vision of a war of annihilation against the Slavic East, and their fate tied Chelmno to the broader genocidal policies that claimed millions across the front lines. The inclusion of Roma, Poles and Soviet Poles at Chelmno illuminates the breadth of Nazi racial policy. The final solution was central, but the camp's work encompassed a larger extermination project. Each group was marked for destruction for different reasons: racial impurity, political defiance, or ideological enmity. Yet all shared the same ultimate destination: suffocation in gas vans and burial in mass graves. For Roma, extermination stemmed from centuries of prejudice, weaponized interstate policy. For Poles, it was the Nazis' determination to reduce them to a nation of slaves, stripping away their culture and leadership. For Soviet Poles, it was the conflation of race and ideology, destroying both the Jewish and Slavic enemy. Chelmno thus became a microcosm of the Nazi worldview, a world divided into masters and subhumans. In its forests, the categories blurred, as victims of different backgrounds perished side by side. To the SS, distinctions hardly mattered once the van's engines roared, and in this indifference lay the full terror of the camp's purpose. The Roma victims of Chelmno faced a particularly tragic erasure, for their genocide received little attention in the post-war years. Entire families disappeared without trace, leaving behind no written records, no ghettos, and no organized networks to preserve memory. Survivors later recounted how Roma were rounded up from the Łódź Ghetto, where they had been confined in appalling conditions, and sent directly to Chelmno. Children, elders, and adults alike were packed into vans, their cries echoing through the countryside. For many SS men, Roma killings carried a particular contempt, as they mocked their victims during the process. Few Roma ever survived to bear witness, making Chelmno one of the most devastating sights of the Podremos. The forest pits filled with their bodies long before the world even acknowledged their persecution. Their destruction was not accidental but deliberate, sanctioned at the highest levels of Nazi policy. Chelmno became a place where centuries of European prejudice culminated in mechanized extermination, and their absence in post-war trials and memorials only deepened the silence around their suffering. For Poles, Chelmno symbolized the price of resistance and the cruelty of occupation. Those accused of aiding Jews or resisting German rule often found themselves marked for elimination. Some were transported quietly to Chelmno, while others were executed in the forests nearby. Unlike Jews, their deaths were not part of the global extermination campaign, but the localized destruction of Polish leadership. The Nazis believed that by murdering priests, teachers, and activists, they could extinguish the soul of the nation. Chelmno thus served a dual role, eliminating Jews as part of the final solution, while simultaneously suppressing Polish identity. Survivors spoke of trucks that carried away Polish men and women, their families never knowing their fate. The victims' anonymity was deliberate, ensuring they vanished without acknowledgement. Their destruction mirrored the larger German policy of General Plan Ost, which envisioned the eventual eradication of much of the Polish population. Chelmno's role was one of many instruments in this grim design, and in its shadows the suffering of Poles intertwined with that of Jews and Roma, all consumed by the same engine of death. The Soviet prisoners of war, who passed through Chelmno, faced an agony compounded by betrayal. Many had already endured months of starvation and brutality in German camps, only to be singled out for transfer to this site of extermination. Their capture had stripped them of status, their uniforms torn away, their humanity denied. At Chelmno they became another expendable category in the Nazi racial hierarchy. They were often forced into work detachments, carrying corpses or building cremation pyres, before being executed themselves. Their treatment reflected Hitler's vision of the war against the Soviet Union as a racial crusade. They were not prisoners to be exchanged or ransomed, but enemies to be annihilated. For Soviet POWs, Chelmno represented the culmination of their suffering, the final indignity after months of degradation. Their deaths were hidden beneath the forest soil, unmarked and unremembered until long after the war. They joined Jews, Poles, and Roma in the silent brotherhood of victims, and their fate at Chelmno underscored the Nazis' unrelenting ambition to eliminate every enemy, real or imagined, in pursuit of racial purity. The victims beyond Jews at Chelmno remind us that the camp was not only a site of the Holocaust, but also a laboratory of broader annihilation. It tested methods of extermination that could be applied to multiple groups, all united in the Nazis' eyes by their supposed inferiority. Roma, Poles, and Soviet Poles died in the same vans, were buried in the same graves, and vanished into the same silence. Their inclusion reflects the Nazi belief in a hierarchy of worth, where only the Aryan master race had the right to exist. Chelmno thus stands not only as a Jewish tragedy, but as a symbol of a racial war against all who resisted or deviated from Nazi ideology. The forest graves bear witness to this diversity of suffering, their silence broken only by survivor testimony decades later. In its cruelty, Chelmno compressed centuries of prejudice into a single machine of death. It showed how easily lines of distinction blurred once the machinery of extermination was in motion. Victims from different paths met the same end, their differences irrelevant to their killers, and in remembering them, we confront the breadth of Nazi inhumanity, which recognized no boundaries in its campaign of destruction. At Chelmno, resistance seemed almost impossible, for the camp was designed to annihilate its victims within hours of arrival. Yet even in this carefully constructed machine of death, there were moments when prisoners fought back or managed to escape. The gas vans, though deadly, offered rare opportunities for resistance during their short journeys from the manor house to the forest graves. Prisoners trapped inside sometimes clawed at the walls, tore at the floorboards, or even broke small openings in the van structure in a desperate attempt for air. In one recorded incident, several individuals managed to push open the rear doors as the vehicle slowed, tumbling out into the road under gunfire. Most were quickly recaptured or shot, but a handful vanished into the woods. These rare survivors carried with them the unspeakable knowledge of Chelmno's purpose. Their testimony would later become crucial in exposing the camp's existence to the outside world. Resistance in Chelmno was not measured in large revolts, but in fleeting, almost miraculous acts of defiance. Each escape challenged the illusion of Nazi control, however briefly, and in those moments the machinery of extermination faltered against the resilience of human will. The forest clearings also provided opportunities, though fraught with danger. Prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando, those forced to bury bodies or burn corpses, sometimes attempted escapes during the long hours of labor. Surrounded by armed guards and dogs, they nevertheless watched for lapses in vigilance. When night fell, The forest became both a prison and a refuge, offering cover but also disorientation. Some tried to slip away during work details, diving into the dense undergrowth while bullets cracked through the trees. Most were hunted down quickly, their bodies left as warnings to others. But a small number managed to evade capture, aided by local villagers who risked their own lives by offering food or shelter. Survivors later recounted how they wandered for days, barefoot and starving, before stumbling into safety. Each escape was a fragile thread connecting Chelmno's hidden atrocities to the broader world. Without these acts of resistance, the camp might have remained shrouded in total secrecy. The forest swallowed thousands, but it also carried out a few who would bear witness, and their testimony ensured that Chelmno's crimes could not remain buried forever. One of the most famous escapes came in January 1942, when a group of prisoners assigned to bury corpses realized their time was short. Knowing they would eventually be killed to erase evidence, they devised a desperate plan. As guards herded them toward the pits, several men suddenly turned on their captors, seizing tools and attacking with shovels. Amid the confusion, a handful broke away and vanished into the trees. Though most were quickly hunted down, 2 men managed to reach nearby villages where sympathetic locals offered aid. These survivors described the gas vans, the pits filled with corpses, and the routine of deception. Their words marked some of the first testimonies about the camp, passed in secret through resistance networks. Such escapes revealed the dual nature of survival, both miraculous and unbearably heavy with responsibility. To live while others perished imposed the burden of memory. These men became living witnesses, compelled to recount horrors few could imagine. Their accounts circulated among Polish underground groups, feeding reports that eventually reached Allied ears, and their courage pierced the veil of secrecy surrounding Chelmno. The structure of the Sonderkommando system itself offered grim possibilities for resistance. Prisoners forced into this role understood they were doomed to eventual execution once they had served their purpose. This knowledge inspired some to resist in small but significant ways, sabotaging burial operations, delaying tasks, or secretly warning new arrivals. A few attempted to document their experiences, scratching notes on scraps of paper and hiding them in the forest. These clandestine messages, buried in jars or tucked beneath roots, spoke of gas vans, cremations, and pits of thousands. Though most were lost, the intent was clear to leave behind traces when the Nazis sought erasure. Others tried to seize weapons from guards, attacking suddenly in hopes of breaking free. Such attempts almost always ended in death, but they revealed a determination not to go quietly. Even within a system built on total control, the spark of resistance remained. It burned in whispered conversations, in defiant glances, and in moments of desperate violence. And in those sparks lay proof that the victims of Chelmno refused to submit entirely to their killers' plans. The stories of survivors also highlight the role of chance in escape. In one case, a man flung from a gas van during a hurried unloading managed to slip beneath the bodies and remain undetected. As guards moved corpses to the pits, he crawled away under cover of darkness, escaping into the forest. Another account tells of a boy who feigned death among the gassed victims, emerging from the pile when the guards departed. He wandered for days, half mad with thirst, before encountering villagers who shielded him. These fragile acts of survival depended on a combination of courage, cunning, and sheer luck. Most who attempted similar feats were swiftly killed, their names lost forever. But those who succeeded preserved memories that could never be erased. Their testimonies after the war provided vivid descriptions of Chelmno's daily operations, from the manor house to the forest graves. Such details offered irrefutable evidence of the camp's role in the final solution. And though their numbers were few, Their voices became vital instruments of remembrance. In escaping death, they carried the truth into history. Resistance also came from outside Chelmno in the form of Polish underground networks. Local villagers, often horrified by what they saw or heard, occasionally aided escapees at enormous personal risk. These networks helped smuggle survivors to safer areas where they could pass on their stories. The Polish resistance relayed reports of Chelmno's activities to London as early as 1942. Though met with skepticism at times, these accounts provided critical confirmation of the Nazis' extermination policies. Survivors often spoke of the villagers who fed them, clothed them, or hid them, despite the danger of execution if discovered. Such acts of compassion revealed the flickering light of humanity in a landscape otherwise dominated by death. Resistance was not only armed struggle, but also the quiet act of saving a life. By aiding escapees, locals ensured that Chelmno's crimes would not remain confined to whispers. Their efforts formed a bridge between the silence of the camp and the awareness of the outside world, and their bravery deserves remembrance alongside the sacrifices of those who resisted within the camp itself. Even in the face of constant terror, small acts of defiance carried symbolic weight. Prisoners sometimes refused to obey orders fully, slowing the pace of extermination with deliberate inefficiency. Others sang prayers or whispered defiant words as they marched toward the gas vans, refusing to surrender their dignity. Such moments may not have altered their fate, but they preserved a measure of human resistance in the face of annihilation. The Nazis sought to reduce victims to faceless masses, yet these acts affirmed individuality. Escape attempts, whether successful or not, shattered the illusion of total Nazi control. Each time a prisoner broke free, however briefly, the regime's machinery was exposed as fallible. Survivors' stories remind us that resistance did not require armies or weapons. It required the refusal to let memory be extinguished. Through testimony, these acts reached far beyond Chelmno, undermining Nazi secrecy. They proved that the victims were not passive but engaged in a struggle, however desperate, for life and truth. And they left behind legacies of courage that outlived their tormentors. The escapes from Chelmno were rare, but their impact was profound. Survivors like Salama Biawina, who fled the camp and wrote detailed reports, ensured that the world would know what had happened in the forests of Chelmno. Their words became some of the earliest evidence of the Nazi extermination process, circulated among Allied governments and resistance groups. These testimonies shaped understanding of the final solution long before the war ended. Without them, Chelmno might have remained hidden in silence, its victims forgotten in unmarked graves. The very act of escaping was thus both survival and resistance, a defiance of the Nazi plan to erase all traces. It was an affirmation that even in the darkest machinery of death, human beings could strike back through memory. Each story of escape carried not only horror, but also a fragment of hope that truth could not be buried forever. And in the post-war years, these testimonies stood as monuments more enduring than stone. They enshrined the memory of those who perished, and they remind us today that even in Chelmno, the camp of near-total annihilation, resistance endured. While Auschwitz and Treblinka would later become synonymous with the Holocaust, Chelmno remained cloaked in near-total obscurity during the war years. The very design of the camp ensured this, for unlike other sites, Chelmno left behind no sprawling infrastructure visible to outsiders. It lacked railway yards with endless lines of transports, or towering chimneys billowing smoke, the grim markers that drew attention elsewhere. Its victims arrived in small convoys, often from nearby towns or ghettos, and disappeared into the forest. The manor house, seemingly an ordinary country building, concealed the machinery of death within. The gas vans, mobile and secretive, left no permanent scars on the landscape. Bodies buried in pits, later exhumed and burned, erased further traces of extermination. This concealment was deliberate, born of Nazi awareness that secrecy was as vital as efficiency. Reports did circulate about atrocities, but Chelmno rarely appeared by name in wartime intelligence. It was not a word spoken widely, even among resistance groups. And so, while other camps began to haunt the imagination of the outside world, Chelmno's silence endured. The invisibility of Chelmno reflected broader failures of wartime communication and recognition. Intelligence networks struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of the final solution, even as fragments of information reached London or Washington. Reports from survivors or resistance groups described gas vans, but these accounts were often dismissed as exaggerations. The Allies, preoccupied with military strategy, found it difficult to distinguish Chelmno's crimes from the chaos of war in occupied Poland. Even within Poland itself, the camp remained more rumor than certainty. Its operations were swift, often annihilating entire communities before news could spread. By the time survivors reached underground networks, their towns had already vanished. Chelmno thus became a void in collective awareness, a place known only to those who had seen it and lived to tell. The Nazis exploited this silence, confident that secrecy would protect them from exposure. Unlike Auschwitz, which became a target of Allied reconnaissance flights, Chelmno never drew direct attention. Its quiet efficiency was its shield, hiding the truth in plain sight. And in this silence, the victims disappeared twice, once in death and again in memory. The world's ignorance of Chelmno also reflected the priorities of wartime reporting. Newspapers in the West occasionally published accounts of atrocities against Jews, but they were often buried in back pages, overshadowed by military headlines. Reports of gassings were treated with skepticism, dismissed as propaganda or unverifiable rumor. Auschwitz, with its vast scale and multiple survivors, eventually broke through this doubt, but Chelmno lacked such voices in the early years. Survivors from Chelmno were pitifully few, their words often lost amid larger narratives. Resistance groups desperately tried to relay details, describing the manor house, the forest pits, and the suffocating gas vans. Yet without photographs or mass testimony, their accounts carried little weight with policymakers. Even the Polish government in exile struggled to make Chelmno a focus of Allied attention. Strategic bombing campaigns, troop movements, and the planning of invasions dominated Allied agendas. The slow trickle of information about Chelmno could not compete with these priorities. And so, even as tens of thousands perished, the camp remained almost invisible in global discourse. Silence became a second layer of the tragedy, deepening the sense of abandonment. The Nazis ensured that Chelmno's operations blended seamlessly into their wider extermination program. Operation Reinhard camps, such as Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, drew more attention because of their larger transports and rail connections. Chelmno, by contrast, targeted communities that could be destroyed swiftly and quietly. Its victims included Jews from small Polish towns, Roma families, and deportees from the Łódź Ghetto. Many were transported in groups small enough to avoid notice, their disappearance attributed to deportation rather than death. The use of gas vans gave the killings an additional cloak of deniability. These vehicles looked like ordinary trucks, blending into the wartime landscape. They could vanish from one location and reappear in another, leaving no fixed structures for reconnaissance to identify. For outsiders, Chelmno seemed less like a camp and more like a rumor whispered through forests. The Nazis counted on this obscurity to secure the camp's effectiveness, and for years they succeeded, leaving Chelmno almost absent from the narrative of war. Inside the ghettos of Poland, however, Chelmno's reputation was known in whispers. Survivors who managed to escape carried with them Accounts of pits filled with bodies and vans filled with the dead. These stories circulated among Jewish councils and underground networks, instilling both terror and disbelief. Many refused to accept that an entire facility existed solely to kill, without labor or imprisonment. For generations accustomed to persecution but not systematic extermination, Chelmno's reality was unimaginable. Some clung to the belief that deportations meant resettlement, despite mounting evidence. Others, having heard the survivors, knew the truth but could not persuade their communities. The silence here was not ignorance but the paralysis of horror. Even when voices spoke, the scale of the crime muted their impact. The result was that Chelmno operated with minimal disruption, its secrecy preserved by disbelief as much as by Nazi deception, and in this paralysis entire populations vanished. For the Allies, the question of Chelmno barely registered compared to other strategic concerns. Intelligence agencies intercepted reports mentioning gas vans, but such fragments were not prioritized. The complexity of verifying events behind German lines, combined with skepticism about the reliability of sources, meant that Chelmno's name seldom surfaced in official discussions. Leaders debated bombing railways to Auschwitz, but no such discussions arose about Chelmno, which lacked infrastructure visible from the air. This invisibility shielded the camp from intervention, even had the Allies been willing to act. At the same time, the Nazi obsession with secrecy ensured that few documents explicitly referenced the camp. Orders were verbal, records destroyed, and terminology disguised. This bureaucratic invisibility contributed to Chelmno's erasure from immediate memory. When compared to the vast machinery of Auschwitz or the uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor, Chelmno seemed like a ghost in the landscape of genocide. It was present in reality, but absent in global awareness, and this absence left the victims doubly silenced. The silence of Chelmno during the war also reflects a moral failing of the international community. Even when rumors circulated, the world often looked away, reluctant to confront the full horror. Western governments, overwhelmed with military priorities, treated reports of extermination as secondary. Anti-Semitism, both open and unspoken, dulled the urgency of response. For Jews trapped in occupied Poland, this silence felt like abandonment. Chelmno became a place where victims died not only without rescue, but also without recognition. Their suffering was not witnessed by the world, only by the perpetrators and the trees that lined the forest. Survivors carried a bitterness that after their miraculous escapes, their words were often met with disbelief. This indifference amplified the cruelty, for the Nazis thrived on secrecy and the indifference of outsiders. The failure to recognize Chelmno during the war years remains one of the most haunting aspects of Holocaust history. It demonstrates how extermination could unfold in silence, unchecked by outside intervention, and it warns us of the dangers of disbelief in the face of atrocity. By the time the world fully grasped Chelmno's existence, the camp had already claimed more than 150,000 lives. Its victims perished largely unseen, their deaths reported too late to alter their fate. The silence that cloaked the camp during the war ensured that its story would emerge only afterward, pieced together from fragments of testimony and sparse documents. Unlike Auschwitz, with its surviving structures, Chelmno left behind ruins and ashes. This absence reinforced its invisibility, even in the post-war imagination. The tragedy of Chelmno lies not only in the lives lost, but in the silence that surrounded them. It was a silence engineered by the Nazis, compounded by disbelief among the oppressed, and cemented by indifference from the outside world. The camp's secrecy became part of its cruelty, ensuring victims vanished without recognition. Only after liberation did Chelmno enter history, no longer a rumor but a confirmed abyss. Yet by then, silence had already played its role in the genocide, and the world's failure to hear remains one of the most haunting echoes of Chelmno's story. By 1943, as the tide of war shifted against the Third Reich, the Nazis grew increasingly anxious about the traces of their extermination program, Chelmno, as the first extermination camp to rely on gas vans had already killed tens of thousands, leaving behind forests filled with mass graves. German leaders recognized that if the Soviets advanced, these sites could expose the scale of their crimes to the world. In response, they launched desperate efforts to erase the physical evidence of genocide. This process began under the code name Sonderaktion 1005, a project designed to exhume bodies and burn them. SS units forced Sonderkommando prisoners to dig up decomposed corpses, arrange them on massive pyres and reduce them to ash. The work was gruesome beyond description, with prisoners collapsing under the stench and grotesque fluids of decayed bodies, guards supervised with whips and rifles, ensuring the tasks continued relentlessly. The purpose was not only destruction, but also deception, turning graves into blank fields and ashes into dust, scattered by the wind. The Nazis hoped to leave no trace of the slaughter that had occurred there, and in Chelmno this campaign of erasure became as systematic as the killing itself. The scale of exhumation was staggering, and its cruelty compounded the suffering of the Sonderkommando. Forest pits, filled with thousands of bodies, were opened, revealing layers of decay that horrified even hardened SS officers. Prisoners dragged bloated corpses with hooks, stacking them onto massive grills constructed of iron rails. Fires were fed with wood, gasoline, and human fat, creating a sickening efficiency in mass cremation. Smoke from these pyres choked the forests, darkening the skies with the residue of annihilation. The process lasted weeks, with ash scattered into rivers or used to cover roads to disguise its source. Prisoners often collapsed from the toxic fumes, yet were beaten back to work. Some were shot simply for faltering under the unbearable task. The SS intended not only to destroy evidence, but also to annihilate the last witnesses once their work was finished. These efforts revealed both the desperation of the Nazis and their unrelenting cruelty. Chelmno's very landscape was reshaped in the attempt to erase it from memory, and yet, in their obsessive destruction, they left traces that historians would later uncover. The manor house at Chelmno, once the central hub of deception and processing, was also targeted for destruction. The Nazis dismantled its structures, tearing down walls and removing fixtures that could identify its use. Gas vans, the primary instruments of killing, were recalled or destroyed to eliminate physical proof of their existence. Documents were burned, prisoner barracks demolished, and equipment scattered or buried. Guards sought to make Chelmno indistinguishable from any ordinary village site, erasing the architecture of extermination. But in their haste, they could not fully obscure the outlines of what had been. Locals remembered the constant stream of trucks, the smoke rising from the forest, the guards who patrolled the grounds. Even if physical remnants were gone, the memory of the camp lingered in human testimony. Prisoners forced into dismantling operations whispered the truth when they could, preserving knowledge despite certain death. And so, though the Nazis believed they had concealed their crimes, they underestimated the endurance of witness memory. Chelmno's destruction became not an erasure, but an unfinished act of concealment. Its silence remained broken by those who remembered. In the summer of 1944, as the Red Army swept westward, Chelmno briefly resumed its murderous work. The liquidation of the Łódź Ghetto, one of the last major Jewish communities in occupied Poland, demanded renewed use of the camp. Once again, victims were brought in, processed and murdered, this time with cremation integrated directly into operations. But the killing resumed only temporarily, for the German front was collapsing. Even as transports arrived, the SS knew Chelmno could not operate for long. Destruction resumed with equal urgency. Bodies burned, records destroyed, structures dismantled. The camp became a site of dual functions, continuing extermination while simultaneously erasing its own existence. For the SS, it was a race against time, driven by fear of Soviet discovery. They understood that Chelmno's role as the first extermination camp carried dangerous significance if exposed, and so the attempt to kill and conceal merged into one frantic effort. The flames that consumed the bodies also consumed the camp itself, and within months Chelmno ceased to function entirely, its ruins left behind as a false emptiness. The destruction of evidence was not only physical, but also psychological. The SS sought to obliterate memory by murdering the last witnesses. Sonderkommando prisoners were executed once their work was complete. Their ashes mingled with those they had burned, guards rotated out, and survivors among the local population were silenced through intimidation or execution. This erasure extended to documents, with euphemisms replacing explicit descriptions in surviving records. Phrases like special treatment and resettlement concealed extermination in the language of bureaucracy. But erasure is never perfect, and fragments slipped through. Testimonies of villagers who heard screams, who smelled burning flesh, could not be eliminated. Survivors who escaped the camp carried their memories beyond Nazi control, and after the war, these fragments, combined with forensic evidence, revealed the truth the SS had tried to bury. The very act of concealment highlighted the crime itself. Chelmno's attempted erasure became a testimony of its scale, and the silence it tried to enforce only deepened the horror when uncovered. The Nazis' efforts to dismantle Chelmno mirrored similar campaigns at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These camps too were dismantled, forests replanted, farms established over the sites of mass murder. At Chelmno, the manor house ruins were leveled, the forest graves disguised with saplings and soil. To the casual observer, the site became a stretch of farmland, indistinguishable from its surroundings. Yet beneath the surface lay the ashes and bone fragments of tens of thousands. Farmers plowed over them, and villagers walked paths where entire communities had been extinguished. The Nazis hoped time itself would obliterate memory, that nature would reclaim the traces of genocide. But bones resurfaced, fragments of human remains unearthed by rain or animals. These remnants defied the attempt at silence, a grim archaeology of survival. They spoke in ways the Nazis could not control, and their presence would later confirm the scale of atrocities at Chelmno. In this way, the land itself became a witness, and its testimony could not be dismantled. For the perpetrators, dismantling Chelmno was an act of desperation and denial. They knew the war was turning, and they feared the judgment that awaited them. To destroy evidence was to postpone accountability, to pretend that the crime had never occurred. But their actions also revealed their knowledge of guilt. If Chelmno had been merely a labor camp, no such frantic concealment would have been necessary. The resources poured into erasing it demonstrated its importance as a site of mass extermination. Even as they fled, the SS sought to maintain control of the narrative, leaving behind a sanitized landscape. But survivors carried the counter-narrative, exposing the lies through testimony. The Nazi attempt at erasure thus failed in its ultimate purpose. Instead of protecting them, it underscored the enormity of their crimes, and in history's judgment, it stands as proof of their consciousness of guilt. Dismantling Chelmno was the final chapter of its operation. but it also became the first chapter of its memory. When Soviet troops reached Chelmno in January 1945, they found little left to see. The manor house lay in ruins, the forest scarred but replanted, the barracks gone to the untrained eye. The site could have been mistaken for an abandoned farmstead, yet beneath the surface, traces of horror remained. Scattered ashes, charred bones, fragments of human remains. Survivors and locals guided investigators to the places where the killings had occurred. Testimonies describe the dismantling, the fires, the frantic efforts to erase the past. What the SS had tried to bury, history unearthed. The silence they sought to enforce was broken by the persistence of memory and evidence. Chelmno's ruins told their story, not through monuments but through absence, an absence that spoke louder than words. The Nazis had failed to erase their crimes, leaving behind a legacy of both destruction and survival. For in the end, no amount of dismantling could erase the truth, and the truth of Chelmno became part of the world's memory of the Holocaust. By mid-1944, as the war neared its climax, the Nazis revived Chelmno, the camp they had once dismantled in their desperate attempt to erase evidence. The reason was the looming liquidation of the Łódź Ghetto, the second largest Jewish ghetto in occupied Europe, which still held tens of thousands of lives in limbo. After months of uncertainty, the ghetto's population faced the dreaded order of deportation. For Nazi planners, Auschwitz was already overwhelmed with arrivals from across Europe, and Chelmno offered a grim solution. Its relative isolation, proven machinery of extermination, and proximity to Łódź made it the perfect site to resume murder on an industrial scale. The manor house had been destroyed, but the forest clearing and mobile gas vans could be reactivated quickly. Once again, SS men returned to the site, setting up new barracks and refurbishing vehicles for their lethal purpose. A camp that was supposed to vanish into memory was brought back to life, reborn as an engine of death. Prisoners whispered the dreadful news: Chelmno lived again. The Nazis had not forgotten its function. They had only paused it, waiting for the moment when its services were needed. And in 1944, that moment had arrived. The Łódź Ghetto had endured longer than most, surviving deportations in 1942, when other ghettos had already been liquidated. For many within its walls, there had been a fragile hope that survival through labor might buy time. Factories hummed with production for the German war machine, and leaders like Chaim Rumkowski clung to the illusion that usefulness would protect them. But by the summer of 1944, Hitler and Himmler had decreed that no Jewish ghetto would remain. The final solution had to be completed, and the last holdout of Jewish life in central Poland was marked for destruction. Chelmno's reactivation was part of this final push, a brutal campaign to wipe out those who had endured for so long. Deportations began once more, with trains from Łódź rattling toward the small station near the village of Kołl. Prisoners stepped down, bewildered by the familiar lies of resettlement that had deceived so many before them. They were herded into trucks and driven to Chelmno's forest. For the SS, it was as if nothing had changed. For the victims, it was the return of a nightmare. The logistics of death resumed with chilling efficiency. Gas vans, long since proven effective, were pressed back into service. Victims were told they were being transported to baths or new settlements, forced to undress, and herded into the sealed compartments. Engines roared to life, pumping exhaust into the interior, asphyxiating men, women, and children in minutes. Guards stood by with practiced indifference, listening to the muffled screams that slowly faded into silence. The vans then drove into the forest, where bodies were unloaded into hastily prepared pyres. Unlike in 1942, when mass graves had dominated, by 1944 cremation was prioritized to erase traces. Flames consumed the corpses, filling the forest with smoke and ash. Prisoners of the Sonderkommando were forced once again to perform this grisly work. The process was relentless, day after day, truck after truck. Chelmno's reawakening was not temporary, it was an all-out campaign of extermination. And for those who arrived from Łódź, there was no escape. The victims who arrived in 1944 came from a ghetto that had already been bled by years of hunger, disease, and despair. They were weaker, frailer, and less able to resist than earlier deportees. Mothers carried starving children, while the elderly shuffled forward with little strength left in their bodies. Some whispered to each other that Chelmno was a death camp, recalling rumors from 1942. But guards and officials silenced questions with brutality, maintaining the facade of resettlement until the last possible moment. The deception was almost unnecessary by this stage, for the victims were too worn down to fight. Yet the Nazis clung to it, as if the ritual of lies was as important as the act of killing itself. Victims were stripped of their belongings, robbed of their last possessions, and driven naked into the gas vans. The screams of children echoed in the forests as the vans departed. The process was so mechanical that survivors later described it as a production line of annihilation. By the time the last transports left the road, the ghetto had been emptied and its people had vanished into Chelmno's fires. SS officer Hans Bothmann oversaw this reactivation, ensuring that the camp functioned smoothly and left no survivors. He coordinated with Gestapo officers in Łódź, guaranteeing that trains arrived on schedule and victims were processed without delay. Bothmann insisted on strict discipline among his men, punishing even minor failures with harsh measures. The guards, veterans of earlier killings, had no illusions about their work. They drank heavily, abused prisoners, and treated the mass murder as routine. Yet beneath this brutal normalcy lay the recognition that the war was slipping away. Soviet armies were advancing westward, and the Nazis knew their time was short. This urgency only accelerated the pace of killing, driving the SS to murder as many as possible before their enemies arrived. For them, Chelmno's return was both a practical solution and a last act of defiance. If they could not win the war, they could at least ensure their victims did not live to see liberation. This cold calculation drove the final wave of extermination, and it revealed the genocidal obsession that consumed the regime until its last days. The Sonderkommando prisoners of 1944 faced the same torment as their predecessors. They were forced to drag corpses from gas vans, load pyres, and scatter ashes into the wind. Day after day, they handled the remains of thousands, often recognizing friends or relatives among the dead. The psychological torture was beyond comprehension, designed to break their spirits before they too were executed. Prisoners tried to leave secret traces, carving messages on trees or burying notes in bottles, desperate to let the world know what had happened. Many whispered prayers as they worked, clinging to scraps of faith in a place designed to erase all humanity. Guards treated them with special cruelty, mocking their suffering and reminding them of their inevitable fate. Yet even under such torment, some prisoners sought ways to resist, sabotaging cremation pyres or slowing the pace of work. Their defiance, however small, carried profound meaning in a place where survival was nearly impossible. By the end of 1944, almost all were murdered, their labor erased along with the bodies they had burned. But their endurance ensured that memory survived where evidence was meant to vanish. The return of Chelmno in 1944 marked one of the darkest chapters of the Holocaust's final phase. Unlike earlier years, when the machinery of extermination was expanding, this revival came at a time when Nazi Germany was collapsing. It was a conscious choice to expend dwindling resources not on defense or survival, but on murder. This obsession revealed the true priorities of the regime: extermination above all else. Entire German divisions were starved of supplies while trucks carried fuel for gas vans at Chelmno. Ammunition that could have been used on the battlefield was instead fired into prisoners who resisted. The camp's reactivation symbolized the genocidal madness of the Third Reich, determined to kill until the very end. For the victims there was no reprieve, no last-minute salvation. Chelmno consumed them in its final burst of violence, erasing communities that had endured so much already. The forest bore witness to this last frenzy of destruction, and history would later recall it as the tragic coda of a place built for death. When the Soviets finally reached Chelmno in January 1945, they found little more than ruins. The Nazis had once again attempted to obliterate the camp, burning structures and scattering ashes before retreating. But the traces remained: bone fragments, charred wood, the faint outlines of mass graves. Survivors' testimonies filled in the silence, confirming that Chelmno had returned to life in 1944, only to die once more in fire. The reactivation had claimed tens of thousands, most from the Łódź Ghetto, completing its liquidation. For decades, this final phase of Chelmno remained overshadowed by Auschwitz, where other transports had been sent. Yet historians gradually pieced together the scale of what occurred, recognizing Chelmno as both the first and one of the last camps of extermination. Its resurrection in 1944 underscored the Nazis' relentless commitment to genocide, even as their empire crumbled. The victims of that final wave were silenced in body, but not in memory. Their fate revealed the futility of Nazi denial, for the truth could not be buried forever, and Chelmno's return of death became one of the Holocaust's most haunting reminders. By late 1944, and into the first days of 1945, Chelmno entered its final and most merciless phase of operation. The Łódź Ghetto had been liquidated, its inhabitants either murdered in the forest of Rzeszów or sent on to Auschwitz for destruction. Yet small groups of prisoners still remained within the camp itself, compelled to labor as Sonderkommando in the service of the SS machine. These men were forced to burn bodies, clear mass graves, and dismantle structures in an attempt to hide evidence. For weeks they toiled in silence, knowing that their survival was only temporary. The SS officers overseeing them issued false assurances, speaking of transfers and new work assignments. But the prisoners understood from whispered rumors and grim precedent that their end was near. The atmosphere grew thick with dread as the camp's activity dwindled and the transport ceased. Where once thousands were brought daily to their deaths, now the final victims were the very laborers who had made the killing possible. This grim cycle marked the end of Chelmno's function. The camp had nearly completed its purpose, and all that remained was to erase its witnesses. The last transports to Chelmno were not the vast convoys that had once emptied ghettos, but small groups, almost footnotes in the record of genocide. Some were Jews discovered in hiding, rounded up from villages or the countryside. Others were stragglers from work detachments or prisoners who had been left behind in Łódź after the ghetto's official liquidation. Each group arrived with no illusions about their fate. Stories of Chelmno had spread too widely by 1945 for deception to succeed fully. Still, the SS went through the motions of deceit, claiming relocation or resettlement, as if ritual demanded it. The victims were taken into the forest, killed swiftly, and their bodies added to the last burning pyres. The gas vans rattled a few final journeys along their deadly route. The ashes of the murdered mingled with the ashes of those who had been consumed years earlier. It was the last cruel chapter in Chelmno's history of extermination, and it sealed the fate of the final innocents brought within its reach. For the Sonderkommando prisoners, the weeks of late 1944 and early 1945 were unbearable. They were worked to exhaustion in freezing conditions, surrounded by the stench of burning flesh and the silence of an abandoned killing ground. Guards forced them to exhume older graves, scattering and burning the bones to obliterate traces of mass murder. The men lived in terror, aware that this work was not for the future of the camp, but for its destruction. They were prisoners of evidence as much as of chains, kept alive only to erase what they themselves had been forced to create. At night they whispered about revolt, but despair crushed most attempts at planning. The SS had grown hyper-vigilant, ensuring no organized resistance could succeed. Food was scarce, beatings were frequent, and exhaustion left many collapsing where they stood. Some prisoners deliberately slowed their work, sabotaging pyres or feigning illness, small gestures of defiance in the shadow of certain death. But these acts were met with merciless executions, each body added to the flames they had tended. By January 1945, the Sonderkommando were reduced to only a handful of broken men, and they understood that their time was measured in days, not weeks. The final liquidation of the camp began with chilling precision. On orders from Berlin and under Himmler's directives to leave no traces, SS Commander Hans Bothmann prepared to eliminate the last laborers. The men were summoned under the guise of reassignment, told they would be transferred deeper into Germany as the front drew closer. They were herded into trucks and driven into the forest, a journey they had watched countless victims make. This time, they knew the trucks would not return for them. In small groups, they were executed with bullets to the back of the head, their bodies burned alongside the countless thousands they had once carried. Some begged for mercy, others shouted defiance, and a few recited prayers as they fell. The guards carried out their task with mechanical cruelty, intent only on finishing before Soviet forces arrived. The forest echoed with the last cries of Chelmno's laborers, drowned quickly by gunfire. By the time silence returned, the Sonderkommando were no more. The men who had been condemned to witness everything were finally silenced forever, and with their deaths, the camp itself reached its final chapter of killing. As January 1945 wore on, the SS moved to dismantle what remained of Chelmno's physical structures. Barracks were destroyed, gas vans hidden or abandoned, and pyres scattered into ash and soil. The Nazis dug furiously, uprooting graves and scattering remains across the forest. Yet the task was impossible to complete, for the land itself bore scars that no amount of destruction could conceal. Bone fragments littered the soil, charred timber spoke of fires, and survivors' testimonies ensured that memory could not be erased. Villagers from nearby communities knew what had occurred, even if they dared not speak aloud during the occupation. The SS believed that by burning and scattering, they could erase a crime against humanity, but history would prove them wrong. The more they tried to cover the evidence, the more they revealed the scale of what had been done. Their obsession with secrecy was itself evidence of guilt, and Chelmno's landscape became a silent witness to both murder and denial. Among the last killings was an act of particular cruelty. In January 1945, as Soviet troops drew dangerously close, the SS executed the final group of Jewish workers who had been kept alive in the village granary. These men had lived in constant fear, working under harsh surveillance, and forbidden from even speaking to one another freely. They were herded into the cellar of the granary and massacred with grenades and gunfire, their bodies buried hastily beneath debris. The killing was not about efficiency, it was about erasing living witnesses before liberation arrived. When Soviet forces entered the area days later, they found only ruins and fragments of what had once been Chelmno. The camp had been silenced, its workers annihilated, its structures destroyed. Yet the stench of death still lingered in the air. Villagers whispered of explosions and screams that had echoed only nights before, and the Soviet soldiers quickly realized they had uncovered a place of extraordinary horror. The Nazis had tried to erase Chelmno, but the traces spoke louder than their denials, and the final liquidation was remembered as both the camp's death and its damning confession. The liquidation of Chelmno was part of a larger Nazi pattern in early 1945. As the Reich collapsed, camps across Poland and the East were evacuated, destroyed or abandoned. The SS consistently murdered those prisoners who knew too much, whether through death marches or massacres on sight. Chelmno fit this pattern precisely, its laborers sacrificed in the name of secrecy. But unlike larger camps such as Auschwitz, Chelmno left behind fewer survivors to testify. Its destruction was nearly complete, with only a handful of escapees carrying the memory forward. This made its crimes all the more insidious, for silence was as much a weapon as gas or bullets. Yet the very thoroughness of Chelmno's erasure became part of its story. The attempt to destroy all traces revealed the scale of what had been hidden, and in the final liquidations the Nazis showed both their cruelty and their fear of history's judgment. For them, death was easier than truth, but the truth still emerged, carved into the ashes and testimonies that survived. The last days of Chelmno encapsulated the essence of the Nazi project of annihilation. Even as their empire collapsed and defeat loomed, the SS prioritized extermination over survival, choosing to kill rather than retreat in order. The camp's final liquidations were a ritual of both destruction and denial, carried out with frantic urgency. Prisoners who had borne witness to every step of the process were erased, their voices silenced in a last burst of cruelty. Yet this very act ensured that Chelmno would remain infamous, for its desperate closure revealed the enormity of what had been attempted. Soviet investigators who entered found enough evidence to piece together the story, aided by the testimony of a small number of survivors who had escaped earlier waves. The silence of the dead was broken by the words of the living, and history would not forget the camp that was first to use gas vans as its weapon of extermination. Chelmno's final liquidations were not the end of its memory, they were the beginning of its legacy as the prototype of genocide. And in that legacy, the voices of the murdered continued to speak. In January 1945, the thunder of Soviet artillery rolled across western Poland, a sound that signaled both liberation and reckoning. The Red Army, advancing relentlessly after victories in the Vistula Order offensive, swept toward the Warta River region. Their objective was to crush the remnants of German defenses and open the path into Central Europe. Along the way, they encountered landscapes scarred by retreat and destruction, villages burned, and roads littered with refugees and retreating soldiers. As the Soviet forces closed in on the small village of Chelmno nad Nerem, they were unaware they were about to uncover one of the darkest sites of Nazi atrocity. The camp had already been dismantled by its SS overseers, its structures torn down, and its witnesses killed. But the land itself bore the scars of genocide, and the Red Army soon realized this was no ordinary battlefield ruin. The stench of burnt flesh still clung to the forests, even in the winter air. Pits of ash and bone fragments protruded from the frozen ground. Villagers whispered of mass killings carried out in secrecy since 1941, and with each step forward, the Soviets began piecing together a crime scene of unimaginable scale. The Soviet troops first encountered the manor house site, which had once served as the headquarters for the SS officers. By the time they arrived, only ruins remained. Walls half collapsed, debris scattered, and signs of recent destruction by explosives. The SS had attempted to obliterate any trace of their activities, reducing the buildings to rubble. But in the snow, charred remains of wooden beams revealed traces of the barracks where prisoners had once been held. Nearby they found scattered personal belongings, shoes, children's toys, torn clothing that spoke louder than any document. These were not the artifacts of soldiers, but of civilians, ripped from their homes and delivered here to die. As the Soviets probed deeper into the site, they unearthed shallow pits filled with ash and bones. The evidence was irrefutable. This had been a killing center, not a labor camp. No workshops or production facilities existed, only tools of extermination. The soldiers, hardened by years of war, stood in stunned silence. Even battlefields had not prepared them for such a sight, and the horror of Chelmno began to sink into their consciousness. In the nearby Rysuchu forest, Soviet investigators discovered the true magnitude of Chelmno's purpose. The woods stretched for miles, but scattered throughout were vast pits, some partially concealed by branches and snow. These were not the scars of battle, but the graves of tens of thousands of murdered men, women, and children. When the Soviets dug into the frozen soil, they uncovered layer upon layer of ash, charred bone, and fragments of human remains. The ground itself seemed to bleed history, as if the earth could no longer contain the crimes it had been forced to swallow. In some places, the outlines of bodies were still visible, clinging together in clusters that testified to their final moments. The investigators also found makeshift cremation grids, where logs and rails had been used to burn exhumed corpses in desperate efforts to destroy evidence. Bones that could not be fully burned had been scattered, yet many remained. These findings revealed the systematic attempt to erase not just human lives, but their very memory. The forest became a silent witness, whispering of crimes the perpetrators had tried to bury, and the Soviets recognized that Chelmno was among the first true extermination centers. The testimony of local villagers helped fill in the gaps left by destruction. Many residents of Chelmno and nearby towns had long suspected the purpose of the camp, though few dared to speak openly while the SS controlled the area. They recounted the ceaseless arrival of trucks, loaded with Jews from Łódź and surrounding regions, that entered the manor grounds and never returned. They described the strange sealed vans that rumbled toward the forest, their engines roaring unnaturally as muffled cries echoed within. Some villagers had been forced by the Germans to dig or cover pits, bearing unwilling witness to mass burials. Others recalled the acrid smoke that drifted for days when cremations took place in the woods. Fear had kept them silent during the occupation, for even a whisper of protest invited execution. Now, with the Soviets present, they spoke of their terror and their helplessness. Their words confirmed what the Red Army already suspected. This was not an ordinary camp, but a place designed exclusively for extermination, and the scale of what they described shocked even hardened Soviet officers. For here, the machinery of death had operated long before Auschwitz became infamous. Amidst the ruins and testimony, a miracle emerged: survivors. Against all odds, a small number of Chelmno prisoners had escaped during earlier phases of the camp's operation. One such figure was Mordecai Podlebnik, a member of the Sonderkommando who had fled in 1942 and lived to tell his story. He and others who survived by escape or by avoiding recapture became vital witnesses to the Soviet investigation. They described the process with haunting precision: the arrival of transports, the forced undressing, the lies about showers, and the suffocation in gas vans. They detailed how bodies were dragged into mass graves, then later exhumed and burned when the SS sought to conceal the truth. Their accounts matched the physical evidence discovered in the forest, providing a chilling confirmation. For the Soviets, these testimonies transformed Chelmno from rumor into documented fact. Survivors explained the torment of Sonderkommando life, the hopelessness of their tasks, and the inevitability of their execution. They carried with them the voices of the countless who could no longer speak, and their courage in recounting the nightmare ensured that Chelmno would not vanish into silence. The Soviet investigators meticulously documented the evidence they uncovered. Photographs were taken of bone fragments, burned remains, and the sites of mass graves. Detailed reports were compiled, noting the dimensions of pits, the estimated number of victims, and the methods of killing described by survivors. These reports became part of the larger Soviet archive of Nazi crimes, later presented at international tribunals. Yet even with this evidence, Chelmno remained overshadowed by larger camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka, whose scale was easier to grasp in numbers and structures. Chelmno's very design, mobile vans, hidden forests, destroyed facilities, made it a ghost among camps. Its horror lay not only in the killings themselves, but in the deliberate attempt to vanish without trace. Still, the Soviet records ensured that Chelmno's name would endure, tied forever to the origins of industrialized extermination. The camp's discovery in January 1945 revealed the full evolution of Nazi genocide, and it demonstrated the lengths to which perpetrators would go to erase their crimes. But the ruins and ashes spoke louder than their silence, and the world was forced to reckon with a place designed to leave nothing behind. For the Red Army soldiers themselves, the discovery left a profound psychological impact. These were men hardened by years of fighting, who had witnessed destruction on an unimaginable scale from Stalingrad to Kursk. Yet many later recalled that nothing had prepared them for the quiet horror of Chelmno. The absence of living prisoners, the silence of the camp, and the sheer emptiness contrasted with the evidence of mass murder. It was as if they had stumbled into a graveyard of ghosts, where every tree and every mound of earth held stories of suffering. The soldiers spoke of an oppressive stillness that lingered in the air, a silence broken only by the crunch of snow and the whispered accounts of villagers. Some Soviet troops confessed that they could not sleep for nights after the discovery, haunted by the images of scattered bones and children's shoes. They realized they were walking not through the ruins of a battlefield but through the remains of an organized slaughterhouse, and it shook their sense of what humanity was capable of. The liberation of Chelmno was unlike any other, for there was no one left to liberate. Only ashes, silence, and the weight of absence remained. The discovery of Chelmno in January 1945 was both an end and a beginning. It marked the final closure of the camp, whose SS had fled, killed their prisoners, and sought to bury their crimes in the soil of Poland. But it also marked the opening of Chelmno's history to the world, as Soviet investigators and survivor testimonies ensured it would not vanish into obscurity. Though it would never achieve the same notoriety as Auschwitz, its significance was immense. Chelmno was the first true extermination camp, the prototype for industrialized mass killing. It pioneered the use of gas vans and taught the Nazis methods of deception and concealment that would be refined elsewhere. Its victims, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were remembered through fragments of bone, scattered belongings, and the courage of a handful of survivors. Liberation did not bring life back to those murdered, but it did preserve their memory, and that memory became part of the collective record of Nazi crimes presented to the world. Chelmno's ruins became a symbol of both annihilation and remembrance, and its liberation was less a rescue than an uncovering of humanity's darkest truth. The liberation of Chelmno left behind a site of ruins, ashes, and scattered bones, but it also raised a pressing question: who would be held responsible for these crimes? In the months after the war, Allied and Soviet investigators began piecing together the identities of the perpetrators who had overseen the camp. Unlike Auschwitz or Majdanek, where many staff were captured at the end of the war, Chelmno's killers had already dispersed into hiding. Many had blended back into German society, assuming false identities or quietly returning to civilian life. The SS men who had operated the gas vans and supervised the Sonderkommando were not faceless functionaries. They were men with names, ranks, and histories. The Soviet archives listed commanders like Herbert Lange and Hans Bothmann, as well as lower-ranking SS guards who had enforced terror. Bringing these men to justice required not only survivor testimony, but also painstaking detective work. The challenge was immense, for Chelmno left little physical evidence and almost no living witnesses. But the pursuit of justice could not be abandoned, and trials would slowly begin to shed light on the human architects of mass murder. The first major figure connected to Chelmno was Herbert Lange, the camp's original commandant. Lange had overseen the camp from its creation in late 1941, transferring his experience from earlier euthanasia programs into the extermination process. He had been instrumental in deploying the first gas vans, adapting technology originally used in the T4 program against the disabled. After leaving Chelmno in 1942, Lange continued to serve in the SS, participating in other atrocities across occupied Europe. At war's end, he was still active, commanding units in the collapsing Reich. But in May 1945, Lange was killed in action by Polish troops, escaping trial and sentencing. His death deprived survivors of a chance to confront one of the earliest architects of mechanized extermination. Yet his legacy remained embedded in testimony and documentation, painting him as a ruthless innovator of mass killing. The shadow of Lange's methods extended far beyond Chelmno, influencing practices at other death camps, and his absence from the dock symbolized the incompleteness of justice. For many victims, the man who began Chelmno's killing would never face accountability. Hans Bothmann, who succeeded Lange as commandant in mid-1942, became a central figure in post-war investigations. Bothmann had refined Chelmno's killing methods, introducing cremation to conceal evidence and supervising the camp's reactivation in 1944. Witnesses described his cold efficiency and his commitment to maintaining the illusion of resettlement for victims until the very last moment. After Germany's defeat, Bothmann was captured by British forces. He was interned for a time, but the complexities of post-war chaos meant his crimes were not immediately prosecuted. In 1946, facing likely extradition to Poland, Bothmann reportedly committed suicide in British custody. His death again deprived the courts of a key witness to Chelmno's operations. Survivors and prosecutors lamented that two of the camp's principal commanders had escaped judgment by fate or their own hand. Their absence underscored the fragility of accountability in the post-war years, but other members of Chelmno's staff would not remain beyond reach, and the pursuit of their trials would bring fragments of justice, though often limited in scope. The first trial specifically addressing Chelmno's crimes took place in Poland in 1945, as part of broader prosecutions of captured Nazis. Local courts, driven by the enormity of the crimes committed on Polish soil, sought to hold perpetrators accountable. In one of these trials, several SS men who had served at Chelmno were brought before the bench. Testimonies from survivors like Mordecai Podlebnik and Simon Sebnik provided vivid first-hand accounts of the extermination process. These witnesses, though young and traumatized, courageously described the gas vans, the mass burials, and the daily mechanics of death. Their words cut through the evasions of the defendants, who often claimed they had simply followed orders. Yet even as some were convicted and sentenced, others managed to minimize their roles and received lighter punishments. The trials revealed both the possibility and the limitations of justice in the immediate post-war years. While the system sought to expose the truth, it was constrained by scarce evidence and the enormity of the crimes. And many Chelmno perpetrators remained unaccounted for. The long struggle for justice had only begun. In the 1960s, renewed attention was given to Chelmno during the wave of war crimes trials in West Germany. This was the era of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, where public opinion began confronting the realities of the Holocaust more openly. German courts summoned surviving SS men who had served at Chelmno, dragging the camp back into the public eye. Among them was Walter Piller, along with other lower-ranking guards and drivers of the gas vans. Prosecutors laid out the details of how these men had participated in the extermination of hundreds of thousands. Once again, survivors such as Simon Srebnick testified, their words echoing decades after they had lived through horror. These trials painted a harrowing picture of Chelmno's daily operations, reconstructing what the SS had tried to erase. But sentencing was often lenient, reflecting the West German judiciary's reluctance to impose severe penalties. Some defendants received only a few years in prison, a punishment grotesquely disproportionate to their crimes. The verdict sparked outrage among survivors and historians, and they highlighted how incomplete justice remained, even 2 decades after liberation. The excuses offered by the Chelmno defendants followed a familiar pattern. They insisted they were only following orders. That refusal would have meant their own execution. Many claimed ignorance of the larger goals of extermination, pretending that their tasks, driving trucks, guarding prisoners, or digging pits, were minor. Some even argued that they tried to mitigate suffering by carrying out their duties efficiently. The courts heard repeated claims of obedience to superiors, an argument that the Nuremberg principles had already rejected. Survivors countered these excuses with chilling testimony, pointing out that the defendants had shown cruelty and initiative beyond orders. The drivers of gas vans knew precisely what they were doing, as they listened to the screams of suffocating victims. Guards beat prisoners, mocked them, and reveled in their power. These were not passive cogs but active participants in mass murder. Yet courts often weighed these excuses with undue sympathy, and justice faltered under the weight of denial, evasion, and bureaucratic complicity. One of the most haunting aspects of Chelmno's post-war trials was the limited awareness of the camp itself. While Auschwitz and Treblinka had become synonymous with the Holocaust, Chelmno remained relatively obscure in public consciousness. This obscurity worked in favor of the defendants, as fewer survivors meant fewer voices to press the case. The sheer lack of public recognition meant the crimes were treated with less urgency than they deserved. Historians later argued that this contributed to the leniency of sentences. The trials, while important, failed to fully impress upon society the magnitude of Chelmno's role as the prototype of extermination camps. Survivors felt their testimonies had been heard but not truly absorbed. They lived with the painful knowledge that their tormentors often walked free after minimal punishment. The lack of widespread outrage reflected a broader post-war struggle to reckon with complicity, and Chelmno's place in justice remained overshadowed, much like its place in history. By the end of the 20th century, most of Chelmno's perpetrators were dead, their crimes only partially accounted for in legal terms. A handful had been executed or imprisoned, but many escaped meaningful punishment. The trials revealed the limits of legal frameworks when confronting crimes of such unprecedented scale. They also revealed the difficulty of prosecuting perpetrators decades later, when memories had faded and evidence had been destroyed. Yet even in their shortcomings, these proceedings served a crucial role. They preserved testimony, documented the crimes, and placed Chelmno into the historical record. They ensured that the perpetrators' names were not lost, nor their excuses unchallenged. The survivors, though few, stood as living witnesses to confront the machinery of denial. Justice for Chelmno was incomplete, but memory was secured through courts, archives, and testimony. And in the end, the trials were less about punishing individuals than about affirming the truth. For even when accountability fell short, the world could no longer claim ignorance of Chelmno's crimes. In the years after the war, Chelmno remained largely absent from the world's collective memory of the Holocaust. While Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek quickly became infamous symbols of Nazi extermination, Chelmno lingered in obscurity. One reason was its physical erasure. By 1945, the SS had destroyed most of the camp's structures, leaving little more than ruins and ashes in the forests of Rzeszów. Unlike Auschwitz, with its barbed wire, barracks and crematoria still standing, Chelmno offered no intact monuments of atrocity. Journalists and investigators who visited the site found themselves walking among empty fields and broken stones rather than towering symbols of horror. In this absence of tangible structures, memory struggled to find anchor. Survivors were few, their testimonies precious but limited in number. The story of Chelmno was instead buried within archives and court transcripts, far from the public eye, without physical remains or large survivor communities to amplify its history. Chelmno faded into the background of Holocaust remembrance. And so, the first extermination camp became one of the least remembered. Another factor was the sheer scale of comparison. Auschwitz murdered over 1 million people. Treblinka and Belzec claimed hundreds of thousands within mere months. Chelmno's toll, while immense, estimated between 150,000 and 200,000, was smaller in raw numbers. This brutal arithmetic shaped public memory, as historians and educators often highlighted the most numerically catastrophic sites. Yet such comparisons obscured Chelmno's unique role as the prototype of extermination. It was here, before Treblinka or Sobibor, that the Nazis perfected the use of gas fans and deception as instruments of genocide. It was here that the model of extermination without registration, selection, or labor was first applied on a mass scale. But the smaller figures meant Chelmno was overshadowed in both trials and history books. For many decades, school curricula and memorials gave priority to Auschwitz as the primary symbol of the Holocaust. In that shadow, Chelmno's pioneering role was rarely discussed, and generations grew up unaware of the camp that began the machinery of annihilation. The destruction of evidence by the Nazis also contributed to Chelmno's obscurity. In 1943, and again in 1944, SS men dismantled the camp, exhumed bodies, and burned remains on open-air pyres. Their aim was clear: to erase all proof of the atrocities committed. By the time Soviet forces arrived, little more than ash, scattered bones, and vague ruins remained. This contrasted sharply with Auschwitz, where documents, infrastructure, and thousands of survivors offered undeniable proof. Chelmno's very invisibility worked against its remembrance. Historians found themselves relying heavily on survivor testimonies and post-war trials rather than physical remains. While powerful, these testimonies were few, and many doubted the possibility of such an operation in the absence of visible ruins. Even in Poland, where the site lay, local memory was often overshadowed by larger, better documented killing centers. The Nazis' attempt to erase Chelmno was tragically effective, not only in covering their crimes but also in shaping how history remembered them. And thus, the camp stood on the margins of Holocaust history. Public awareness was also shaped by the survivors who could speak. Auschwitz produced thousands of witnesses who could testify to its horrors in dozens of languages across the globe. Treblinka and Sobibor had fewer, but still enough to build a chorus of voices. Chelmno, by contrast, left only a handful of survivors, most of them members of the Sonderkommando who had escaped against impossible odds. Figures like Mordecai Poczerblinka and Simon Srebnik bore the immense burden of representing the countless dead. Their words were detailed, harrowing, and invaluable, but they could only reach so far. A few testimonies struggled to match the impact of thousands. This imbalance meant Chelmno was underrepresented in media, films, and post-war trials. When survivors did speak, they often faced disbelief, as their descriptions of gas vans and mobile extermination seemed beyond imagination. The tragedy of Chelmno was compounded by this silence of numbers, for memory thrives on voices, and Chelmno had too few left to cry out. In Western scholarship, Chelmno often appeared as a footnote in the larger story of the Holocaust. Historians in the 1950s and 1960s focused on Auschwitz and the final solution's grand scale, leaving smaller extermination camps underexplored. Only later did specialized researchers begin reconstructing Chelmno's history in detail. But without monuments or major memorial campaigns, public audiences rarely encountered its story. Even in Poland, where survivors and witnesses spoke, emphasis was placed on sites like Majdanek and Auschwitz, which attracted international visitors. Chelmno's rural location, far from major urban centers, made it less accessible to journalists and educators. As Cold War politics divided memory between East and West, Chelmno remained largely confined to Polish and Soviet archives. It was a camp remembered primarily in specialist circles rather than the global stage. The result was a strange paradox. The birthplace of extermination remained almost invisible in public consciousness, and this invisibility shaped how generations understood the Holocaust. The struggle for Chelmno's memory also reflected broader patterns of Holocaust commemoration. In the post-war years, remembrance often centered on symbols of survival and resistance. Auschwitz, with its liberated prisoners and iconic gates, embodied both suffering and endurance. Chelmno, in contrast, had no liberated survivors in 1945. The camp was empty, its victims reduced to ash. Liberation without life offered no image of salvation for the cameras. This absence of liberation photographs, testimonies on site, or iconic ruins deprived Chelmno of the visual memory that shaped so much of Holocaust education. Survivors like Srebnik, who testified in later trials, could describe Chelmno, but audiences could not see it with their own eyes. Memory thus became abstract, dependent on words rather than images, and in an age where photographs often determined historical visibility, Chelmno's lack of visual evidence doomed it to obscurity. This absence continues to challenge educators and memorial institutions today, for Chelmno represents annihilation so complete that even memory struggles to survive. Over time, efforts were made to reclaim Chelmno's place in Holocaust history. In the 1960s, Polish authorities created a small memorial on the site, later expanded with a museum and archaeological work in the forest. Excavations revealed mass graves, cremation sites, and artifacts of victims, bringing physical proof back into view. Historians compiled testimonies, documents, and forensic findings into detailed studies of the camp's operation. Yet even with these efforts, Chelmno never gained the global recognition of Auschwitz. Media coverage, educational curricula, and popular films rarely included its story. Survivors lamented that Chelmno remained the forgotten camp, overshadowed by more visible sites of genocide. The tragedy of invisibility continued, even as scholarly work established its critical role in the Holocaust's evolution. Today, the Chelmno Memorial serves as a solemn reminder, but it draws fewer visitors than other sites. And the camp remains a symbol of how history can forget even the most profound horrors. Chelmno's obscurity forces us to confront the fragility of memory itself. The Nazis succeeded not only in murdering entire communities, but also in nearly erasing the evidence of their crime. In doing so, they robbed the victims not only of life, but also of remembrance. The world's failure to fully recognize Chelmno reflects this secondary victory of silence. Yet its history, when told, shatters the illusion of ignorance. It reminds us that genocide can be hidden, its evidence burned, and its victims silenced, unless memory is deliberately preserved. Chelmno's story compels us to widen our gaze beyond the iconic sites of atrocity. It demands that we honor the forgotten dead with the same intensity as those remembered. In its ashes, we find both the horror of annihilation and the warning of how easily memory can fade. Chelmno is not merely a forgotten camp, it is a lesson in the vulnerability of truth, and remembering it is an act of defiance against erasure itself. Chelmno stands as the first fully realized site where mass extermination was industrialized, making it the grim prototype for the Holocaust's machinery of death. Before the larger camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz became synonymous with genocide, Chelmno had already tested the methods of deception, transport, and killing that would later be replicated. Here, mobile gas vans replaced traditional executions, combining technological ingenuity with barbaric purpose. The camp demonstrated that mass murder could be organized as a process, hidden under the veneer of bureaucratic efficiency. Victims were transported under the guise of resettlement, stripped of belongings, and killed within hours of arrival. Chelmno revealed the chilling truth that genocide did not require sprawling infrastructure, only intent, secrecy, and ruthless precision. It proved that even a modest estate and forest could become a site of mass annihilation. The camp was not merely a local atrocity, but a blueprint for genocide on an unprecedented scale. By studying Chelmno, historians uncover the beginnings of a system that engulfed Europe. Its lessons reveal how quickly death can be systematized when ideology merges with logistical planning, and this reality forces us to recognize the terrifying efficiency of human cruelty. The story of Chelmno reminds us that genocide can begin quietly, without grand declarations or towering camps visible to the world. Unlike Auschwitz, where the very sight of the crematoria became symbols of horror, Chelmno operated in the shadows. Its gas vans left little trace, and its forest graves absorbed the evidence of slaughter. The camp's small scale did not diminish its brutality, it intensified it, showing how invisibility could magnify atrocity. Victims vanished with such speed that their existence seemed to dissolve into silence. For local villagers, the muffled cries and strange smoke were the only clues of what transpired. This pattern of concealment foreshadowed the wider Holocaust, where secrecy was a weapon as deadly as bullets. Chelmno teaches us that the absence of visibility does not mean the absence of horror. It shows how easily the machinery of death can operate unnoticed by the wider world. And it warns us that modern atrocities often thrive in hidden places. Chelmno's invisibility is both its tragedy and its greatest warning to future generations. A critical lesson of Chelmno lies in the role of deception. The victims, often told they were being resettled to work in the East, carried hope into the manor house that served as their processing site. The Nazis weaponized trust, exploiting the human desire for survival until the very last moment. Deception was not incidental, it was central to the process of extermination. It minimized resistance, silenced panic, and allowed the killers to manage mass murder with chilling calm. This psychological warfare was as destructive as the physical act of gassing. By the time victims realized the truth, they were already trapped inside vans filled with exhaust fumes. Chelmno demonstrates how lies, propaganda, and manipulation can enable atrocities on a massive scale. It also shows that violence does not always come with open brutality. Often it wears the mask of false promises. In this way, Chelmno's operation becomes a warning about the dangers of state-controlled deceit, and it forces us to recognize how propaganda can be as lethal as weapons. The human element of Chelmno also carries vital lessons. The perpetrators were not abstract forces of evil, but ordinary men, often from police battalions or SS units, who became desensitized to killing. Commandants like Herbert Lange and Hans Bothmann oversaw the operations with bureaucratic detachment, proving how ideology can warp morality. Their cruelty was not spontaneous but institutionalized, carried out within a system that rewarded efficiency in death. At Chelmno, murder became routine, and those responsible treated it as a daily task. This banality of evil demonstrates how ordinary structures, schedules, transports, and procedures can disguise mass murder as administrative duty. The camp also reveals how quickly individuals can adapt to atrocity when it is normalized. Chelmno forces us to ask, what makes people participate in such crimes? Was it fear, obedience, or conviction? The answer lies in the dangerous mix of ideology and careerism, which blurred the line between murder and service. In this, Chelmno offers a profound warning about the capacity for human beings to commit atrocities under orders, and it reminds us that perpetrators were not monsters alone, but people who chose to act monstrously. Equally important are the lessons drawn from the victims of Chelmno. They were not faceless masses, but families from towns, villages, and ghettos, each with their own stories and lives. Jews from the Łódź Ghetto, Roma communities, Polish villagers, and Soviet prisoners of war all perished here. Each transport carried not statistics, but individuals with hopes, traditions, and identities erased in silence. The victims' experiences teach us about the vulnerability of civilians in the face of totalitarian power. They also highlight how quickly lives can be uprooted, moved, and extinguished when rights are stripped away. Survivors like Simon Sribnik carried the memory of those who could no longer speak, ensuring their suffering was not forgotten. Their testimonies become living proof of what denial seeks to erase. Chelmno reminds us that remembrance is not simply about numbers, but about restoring individuality to those consumed by genocide. It shows that memory itself is an act of resistance against dehumanization, and it compels us to see victims not as a faceless collective, but as human beings robbed of futures. The post-war obscurity of Chelmno offers lessons about memory and forgetting. The camp's destruction, the scarcity of survivors, and its absence from iconic Holocaust imagery allowed it to fade from popular consciousness. This demonstrates how easily history can lose sight of critical truths when evidence is destroyed. Chelmno warns us that memory is fragile, and without active preservation, even the greatest crimes risk being buried. The Nazis nearly succeeded in erasing Chelmno, not only physically, but also from history itself. It was only through survivor testimonies, post-war trials, and later archaeological work that its reality was reconstructed. This teaches us that remembrance requires vigilance and effort. It cannot be left to chance. The fragility of Chelmno's memory mirrors the fragility of truth in an age of denial and distortion. Its lessons urge us to actively resist attempts to erase or minimize genocide, and they show that silence, even unintentional, can become an accomplice to forgetting. From Chelmno, we also learn about the progression of genocide itself. What began as an experimental site of mass killing became the model for the larger extermination camps of Operation Renhand. Chelmno was proof of concept, testing gas vans, refining methods of deception, and streamlining body disposal. Once perfected, These techniques were exported to Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, where hundreds of thousands perished in months. The camp's history shows that genocide evolves, adapting methods to maximize efficiency. It warns us that once killing is systematized, it can spread rapidly across borders and institutions. Chelmno reveals the danger of seeing small-scale atrocities as isolated events. In truth, they are often the testing grounds for horrors yet to come. The camp demonstrates how localized brutality can expand into continental catastrophe. Its legacy lies in exposing the mechanics of genocide's growth, and it reminds us that early warnings must never be ignored, for they signal the storms to come. Ultimately, the lesson of Chelmno is that remembrance is an act of resistance against erasure and denial. The camp, though nearly forgotten, embodies the earliest industrialization of genocide in modern history. It compels us to recognize that atrocity does not always announce itself. It begins in shadows, in experiments, in remote places. Chelmno's silence teaches us the cost of ignoring the invisible. Its obscurity warns us how easily truth can be buried, and how urgently it must be preserved. The camp story also highlights human resilience. Survivors who escaped carried memory forward despite unimaginable trauma. Their voices prove that even in places designed to obliterate, traces of truth survive. Chelmno's legacy is both a tragedy of annihilation and a call to vigilance. It asks us to confront the uncomfortable fact that such horrors were possible, and therefore could be possible again. By remembering Chelmno, we not only honor its victims, but also strengthen our resolve to resist future genocides. And in doing so, we transform remembrance into a shield against history's repetition.